Chapter 1. The Assignment. Tonks could have gone home. She should have, really. Her shift at the ministry had run long enough, chasing down leads on unauthorized portkey usage that had led nowhere but to dead ends and paperwork. The familiar weight of exhaustion pressed against her shoulders as she apparated into the narrow alley behind Grimmauld Place, her pink hair shifting to a tired brown without conscious thought. It would have been easy to slip away, to claim she hadn't received the message, to pretend she hadn't seen Kingsley waiting in the shadows by the back entrance. But something in his posture, the way he held himself too still, like a man bracing for an unpleasant conversation, made her stomach tighten with unease. "Watcher, Kingsley," she said, keeping her voice light as she approached. "Bit late for a social call, isn't it?" He turned, and the streetlight caught the worry lines around his eyes. "Tonks, I need to speak with you. Orders from Dumbledore." The formal way he said it, not Albus, not the chief, but Dumbledore with all its weight of authority, made her straighten instinctively. She'd been an Auror for barely a year, an Order member for even less, and the hierarchy still felt new and uncomfortable around her, like an ill-fitting cloak. "What kind of orders?" she asked, though part of her already didn't want to know. Kingsley glanced around the empty street before answering. "Special protection detail. Harry Potter. Tonight through morning. 10 to 6. "Protection?" Tonks felt her hair shift from brown to an alarmed shade of orange. "What kind of protection? Is something going to happen?" "No." Kingsley's voice was carefully measured. "Nothing specific. But given recent events, the Dementor attack, the Ministry's hostility, the upcoming hearing, Dumbledore wants extra security. Someone posted outside his room, just in case." The explanation felt wrong somehow, like a puzzle piece that almost fit, but not quite. Tonks had been part of the advance guard that brought Harry to Grimmauld Place just yesterday. She'd seen how carefully warded the building was, how many Order members were already staying here. The idea that one more person sitting in a hallway would make any meaningful difference seemed... "Why me?" she asked. "You're qualified. You know the boy. You're available." Kingsley's answers came too quickly, as if rehearsed. "And frankly, you're one of the few Order members young enough to relate to him if he has trouble sleeping." That last bit felt more genuine, though it raised its own questions. What kind of trouble sleeping were they expecting? And why hadn't anyone mentioned this when they'd discussed Harry's situation at yesterday's meeting? "Kingsley," she said slowly, "if this is just about extra protection, why not just strengthen the wards? Or assign someone inside the room with him? Why specifically outside his door?" Something flickered across his face. Doubt, maybe, or discomfort. "Those are the orders, Tonks. 10 to 6 outside his room. Keep watch. Report anything unusual." Report to whom? She almost asked. But the way Kingsley was already turning away suggested the conversation was over. Official channels, she supposed, which meant Dumbledore, ultimately. "Right," she said instead. 10 to 6. Got it." He nodded and disapparated with a soft pop, leaving her alone in the alley with questions multiplying in her mind like Cornish pixies. She stared at the spot where he'd been standing, then at the back entrance to number 12. Through the grimy windows, she could see the warm glow of light from the kitchen, where voices murmured in conversation. Order members, probably, discussing things she wasn't senior enough to be included in. The thought stung more than it should have. She was here, wasn't she? Trusted with assignments, but standing in the alley, receiving orders second-hand, instead of being in that kitchen where decisions were made, felt distinctly like being on the outside, looking in. She checked her watch. 9:45. 15 minutes to get inside and find her post. The back door opened to familiar, controlled chaos. "Mrs. Weasley bustled between sink and stove, muttering about proper nutrition, while Hermione sat at the scrubbed wooden table surrounded by books. Ron was slouched in a chair nearby, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, while the twins huddled together in the corner with materials that were definitely not Ministry-approved. "Watch her, everyone!" Tonks called, slipping inside and letting the door swing shut behind her. "Tonks!" Mrs. Weasley turned with a relieved smile. "Perfect timing. I was just about to send a plate up to Harry, but if you're here—" "Actually," Tonks interrupted, "I'm on assignment tonight. Guard duty." Mrs. Weasley's smile faltered. "Guard duty? But we've got wards, and Sirius is here, and orders from Dumbledore," Tonks said, borrowing Kingsley's formal tone. "Just extra precaution." Something shifted in the kitchen's atmosphere. Fred and George exchanged glances. Hermione looked up from her book with sharp interest. Ron frowned like he was working through a particularly difficult Quidditch play. "Where's Harry now?" Tonks asked. "Upstairs," Mrs. Weasley said, her voice careful. "Third floor, second door on the left. He had a difficult day. The hearing preparations, you know. Remus thought it best he get some rest." There it was again. That feeling of information withheld, of conversations happening just outside her earshot. What kind of difficult day? And why did everyone look like they were walking on dung bombs around the subject? "Right," she said. "I'll just head up then." She found the stairs and climbed, noting how the old house settled and creaked around her. On the second floor, she glimpsed Sirius through a partially open door, sitting at a desk with papers spread before him. His dark hair fell forward as he bent over what looked like letters, and something in his posture reminded her uncomfortably of Kingsley in the alley. Tense, preoccupied, carrying weight he couldn't share. "Sirius?" she called softly. He looked up, and for a moment she saw something raw in his face before his expression smoothed into careful neutrality. "Tonks, what brings you upstairs?" "Guard duty. Harry's room." She gestured toward the stairs leading to the third floor. "Dumbledore's orders." If she expected him to look confused or ask why, she was disappointed. Instead, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he glanced toward the ceiling, as if he could see through it to the room above. "I see," he said quietly. "Do you?" Tonks stepped closer to his doorway. "Because I don't, really. Extra protection for what? The house is warded 6 ways to Sunday. There are order members here round the clock, and Harry's been here all of one day. What are we protecting him from that requires me to sit in a hallway all night?" Sirius was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Sometimes protection isn't about external threats, Tonks. Sometimes it's about making sure someone doesn't do something rash." The words hit her like cold water. "Rash? You mean, you think Harry might try to leave?" "I think," Sirius said, still not looking at her, "that 15-year-old boys who've been through what he's been through don't always make the most rational decisions, especially when they're angry." And is he? Angry? This time Sirius did look at her, and the sadness in his eyes was answer enough. "Wouldn't you be?" Before she could respond, a sound from the floor above made them both freeze. A sharp cry, cut off abruptly, as if someone had woken from a nightmare and immediately tried to muffle their own distress. Sirius was on his feet instantly, but Tonks was already moving toward the stairs. "I've got it," she said. "That's what I'm here for, isn't it?" She climbed to the third floor, her footsteps soft on the worn carpet. The second door on the left was closed, but she could hear movement behind it. The creak of bed springs, the shuffle of feet on floorboards, the careful quiet of someone trying not to be heard. She settled herself against the opposite wall, sliding down until she was sitting with her back pressed to the faded wallpaper. From here, she could see both ends of the hallway and Harry's door, the perfect position for a guard or a jailer. The distinction felt more important than it should have. Another sound from Harry's room, softer this time. A voice, too muffled to make out words but thick with distress. She found herself leaning forward, straining to listen despite herself. Every instinct she had as an aura, as an Order member, as someone who'd spent yesterday watching Harry's white-faced terror during the flight to London, told her to knock on that door and check if he was all right. But her orders were to stay outside, to watch, to report. She stayed put, feeling like a coward. The old house settled around her with groans and whispers, and Tonks began her vigil, wondering exactly what she was guarding Harry Potter from, and increasingly afraid she already knew the answer. Chapter 2. Nighttime Revelations. The first scream came at 11:30. Tonks jerked upright from where she'd been dozing against the wall, her hair flashing from sleepy brown to alert purple in the dim hallway light. The sound had been sharp and desperate, cut off so abruptly she might have thought she'd imagined it, except for the way her heart was racing and the sudden tension that filled the old house like a held breath. She pressed her ear to Harry's door, listening. Silence, but not the peaceful kind. This was the careful quiet of someone trying not to be heard, the kind she'd learned to recognize during her aura training when suspects were trying to hide in dark corners. Another sound, softer this time, but unmistakably distressed. A voice, thick with tears and terror, murmuring words she couldn't make out through the heavy wood. Her orders had been clear. Stay outside, watch, report anything unusual. But what counted as unusual? Harry Potter having nightmares certainly wasn't surprising, given what he'd been through. The Dementor attack alone would give anyone nightmares, never mind whatever else had happened to him this summer. The murmuring stopped, replaced by the creak of bed springs and the shuffle of bare feet on floorboards. He was awake then. That was good. She could go back to her vigil, report that Harry had experienced some bad dreams, but was managing them himself. No need to interfere. Then came the sound that decided things for her. A choked sob, quickly muffled, but not quickly enough. Tonks found herself on her feet before she'd consciously made the decision. Her hand was already reaching for the door handle when her training reasserted itself. You don't enter without permission. You don't violate someone's privacy just because you're curious. You especially don't enter a teenage boy's bedroom in the middle of the night without very good reason. But another muffled sob provided all the reason she needed. She knocked softly. Harry, it's Tonks. Are you all right? The sounds from within stopped immediately, as if someone had cast a silencing charm. She waited, counting her own heartbeats, before trying again. Harry, I'm not going anywhere, so you might as well answer. I'm fine. His voice came through the door, carefully controlled, but rough with sleep and tears. Just a dream. Sorry if I woke you. You didn't wake me. I'm supposed to be awake, that's why I'm here. She pressed her palm flat against the door, wishing she could see through it. Mind if I come in? I could use the company, actually. Guard duty gets pretty boring. A long pause. Then, the door's not locked. She turned the handle slowly, giving him time to object if he wanted to, and stepped into the room. It was darker than the hallway, lit only by streetlight filtering through thin curtains, but she could make out Harry sitting on the edge of the bed. His hair was wilder than usual, sticking up at odd angles, and even in the dim light she could see the shine of tears on his cheeks. He looked impossibly young. Hey, she said softly, closing the door behind her, but leaving it unlocked. Rough night. He wiped at his face with the back of his hand, the gesture sharp and angry. I said I'm fine. Right. And I'm a natural blonde. She moved carefully to the room's single chair, a rickety thing that had seen better decades and settled into it. Want to talk about it? Not really. Fair enough. She stretched her legs out, making herself comfortable. Mind if I stay anyway? Like I said, it's dead boring out in that hallway. At least in here I can see if you're planning to do a runner in the middle of the night. He looked up sharply at that. A runner? Sirius seems to think you might try to leave. Something about 15-year-old boys making rash decisions when they're angry. She kept her voice light, conversational. Are you? Angry, I mean. Harry was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and tired. Wouldn't you be? Probably. Depends what I was angry about. Everything. The word came out like a confession. The Dursleys, the ministry, the hearing, people not telling me anything, being stuck in this place while everyone else gets to do something useful. He trailed off, then looked at her with something like suspicion. Why are you asking? Are you supposed to report back about my mental state or something? The question hit uncomfortably close to home. My orders are to keep watch and report anything unusual. Having feelings about your situation doesn't strike me as unusual. And if I told you I was planning to leave? Tonks considered this. I'd probably ask where you were planning to go. And then I'd ask if you had a plan that didn't involve getting yourself killed, because I'm fairly sure that would count as unusual enough to report. Despite himself, Harry's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. I'm not planning to leave. I wouldn't know where to go anyway. Good. Because frankly, I'd feel like an idiot if I had to chase a 15-year-old across London in the middle of the night. She shifted in the chair, which creaked alarmingly. So if it's not escape plans keeping you awake, what is it? The dreams? His shoulders tensed. I don't want to talk about it. Okay. What if you tell me about your summer instead? Before you came here, I mean. If she thought that would be easier territory, she was wrong. Harry went rigid, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. Why? Because you look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in months, and Mrs. Weasley's been fussing about getting some meat on your bones since yesterday. Makes a person curious about what kind of summer you had. The usual kind. His voice was carefully neutral. Boring. Lots of chores. Tonks had interviewed enough reluctant witnesses to recognize evasion when she heard it. But she also knew that pushing too hard, too fast, usually made people shut down completely. So instead of pressing, she leaned back in the creaky chair and waited. The silence stretched between them, comfortable enough that she began to think he might actually fall back asleep. Then, without warning, he spoke again. They locked me in, he said quietly. After the Dementor thing. Uncle Vernon put bars on my window and locks on my door. Said I wasn't to be trusted loose in the house after bringing freaks to the neighborhood. Tonks felt something cold settle in her stomach. Locked you in your room? Brought me meals twice a day. Well, sometimes twice a day. Harry's voice was still carefully flat, as if he were discussing the weather. Depended on how angry Uncle Vernon was about something. Some days he forgot. Harry, she started, but he kept talking, as if he hadn't heard her. The funny thing is, I used to think Hogwarts was like a prison sometimes. All those rules, being watched all the time, not being able to leave the grounds without permission. But at least at Hogwarts, I could go to the Great Hall whenever I wanted. I could talk to people. I could use the loo without having to bang on the door and beg. The cold feeling in Tonks's stomach was spreading, creeping up her spine like ice water. How long? What? How long were you locked in? Harry shrugged, the gesture too casual for the words that followed. Most of July. until the order came to get me. Most of July, Tonks repeated, her voice carefully level. That's more than 3 weeks, Harry. Yeah, well. He wiped at his eyes again, angry at the fresh tears. At least it's over now, right? I'm here. I'm safe. I've got the blood protection or whatever. That's what matters. But Tonks was thinking about blood protection, about the logic that said Harry had to return to Privet Drive every summer, had to call it home for the magic to work. She was thinking about Dumbledore's careful explanations, about the importance of family, about sacrifice, about the power of his mother's love living on in her sister's house. She was thinking about how none of that required a 15-year-old boy to be locked in a room like an animal. Harry, she said slowly, when you have the dreams, the nightmares, what are they about? He looked up sharply, and she saw wariness flash across his face. Why? Because you've been through something terrible, and nightmares are normal after trauma. But sometimes they can be more than just dreams. For a moment, she thought he would clam up again. Then he seemed to deflate, all the fight going out of him at once. It's him, he whispered. Voldemort. Sometimes I dream about the graveyard, about Cedric dying, about the curse that didn't work on me. But other times, he swallowed hard. Other times it's like I'm seeing things through his eyes, places I've never been, people I don't know, and when I wake up, my scar burns. The cold feeling had reached Tonks's chest now, making it hard to breathe. How long has this been happening? Since the graveyard. Since he came back. Harry looked at her with desperate eyes. You can't tell anyone. Please. They'll think I'm going mad, or that I'm dangerous, or... Harry. She leaned forward, her voice urgent but gentle. This isn't your fault. Whatever connection you have with him, it's not because you're going mad or because you're dangerous. It's because he tried to kill you as a baby and failed. Magic like that leaves marks. You don't understand. His voice cracked. Sometimes I can feel what he's feeling. The anger, the hate, the pleasure when he hurts people. And sometimes... He stopped, wrapping his arms around himself, as if he could hold the words in. Sometimes what? Sometimes I like it. The admission came out as a whisper. When he's angry, when he's hurting someone who's crossed him, there's this moment where I understand, where I want the same things he wants. And that's not normal, is it? That's not something a good person feels. Tonks felt her heart break a little. Here was this boy, and he was just a boy, despite everything he'd been through, convinced that he was turning into a monster, because he occasionally felt echoes of the darkest wizard in generations. A boy who'd been locked in a room for weeks, who'd watched his friend die, who'd been told repeatedly that he was special, chosen, important, without anyone explaining what that actually meant for his daily reality. Harry, she said firmly, you are not Voldemort. You're not turning into him. You're a 15-year-old boy who's been through more trauma than most adults could handle, and you're having a perfectly understandable reaction to an unprecedented magical situation. But the connection is not your choice and not your fault. She moved from the chair to sit on the edge of the bed, close enough that she could see the hope warring with fear in his eyes. Has anyone explained to you what it might mean? Has anyone talked to you about what to do when it happens? He shook his head. Dumbledore knows, I think. But he hasn't. We haven't really talked about it. There's been so much else going on with the ministry and the hearing and everything. Right. Tonks felt a flicker of something that might have been anger. Well, first things first. You're not going mad. You're not dangerous. And you're certainly not turning into Voldemort because you occasionally feel echoes of his emotions. That's like saying you're turning into a radio because you can hear the broadcast. Despite everything, Harry actually smiled at that. A radio? Terrible metaphor, I know. But the point stands. She settled more comfortably on the bed, keeping her voice steady and reassuring. The connection is real, but it doesn't define you. It doesn't make you like him. It just makes you, well, it makes you someone who needs to be a bit more careful about emotional regulation than most people. And if I can't regulate it, then you learn. Same way you learned everything else. With help, with practice, with people who care about you, making sure you don't have to figure it out alone. She looked at him seriously. Speaking of which, you can't keep this to yourself, Harry. I know you're scared about how people will react, but this isn't something you should be dealing with on your own. But if they think I'm dangerous, then they're idiots. The vehemence in her own voice surprised her. Harry, you've just told me that you're having visions of the darkest wizard alive, that you can feel his emotions, that you sometimes respond to them, and your biggest worry is that you might not be a good person because of it. Does that sound like someone who's dangerous, or does it sound like someone who needs support? He was quiet for a long moment, considering this. You really think it's okay? That I'm not broken? I think you're dealing with an impossible situation with more grace and self-awareness than most people would manage. She reached out and squeezed his shoulder gently. And I think you deserve better than being locked in a room all summer while trying to process it alone. That brought fresh tears to his eyes, though these seemed different somehow, less desperate, more relieved. Thank you, he said quietly, for listening, for not thinking I'm mental. Any time. She glanced toward the window, where the streetlight showed the faintest suggestion of dawn. Think you might be able to get some more sleep? Maybe. If... He hesitated, then forged ahead. If you don't mind staying, just until I fall asleep. I know it's not part of your assignment, but... Harry, she interrupted gently. My assignment is to keep watch over you. Making sure you feel safe enough to rest absolutely falls under that heading. She moved back to the chair, which protested her weight with another alarming creak, and settled in to keep vigil. Harry lay back down, pulling the blanket up to his chin, and for a few minutes the room was quiet except for the distant sounds of London waking up. Just as she thought he might have drifted off, his voice came again, soft and drowsy. Tonks? Yeah? You won't tell anyone? About the visions and the rest of it? She was quiet for a moment, weighing her words carefully. I won't tell anyone without talking to you first. But Harry, this is important information. People who care about you, and who might be able to help, should know about it. I know. Just not yet? Not yet, she agreed. Get some sleep. Within minutes, his breathing had evened out into the rhythm of genuine rest. Tonks stayed where she was, watching the rise and fall of his chest, thinking about blood protection that required a boy to be locked in a room, thinking about nightmares that were more than nightmares, and 15-year-olds who worried about becoming monsters, thinking about orders to guard a door and starting to wonder exactly what she was supposed to be guarding against. As the first real light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, Tonks made herself a promise. Whatever else happened, Harry Potter would never have to face his demons alone again. Not on her watch. Chapter 3. Uncomfortable Questions. Tonks woke, slumped in the rickety chair, her neck protesting the awkward angle, and her hair an unconscious shade of worried grey. Pale morning light filtered through Harry's curtains, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was or why every muscle in her body ached. Then she saw Harry, still asleep in the narrow bed, his face younger and more peaceful than it had been in hours. The conversation from the night before came flooding back. The nightmares, the visions, the casual way he'd described being locked in a room for most of July, like it was perfectly normal. Her stomach churned with a mixture of anger and something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. She was an aura. She was supposed to protect people, to notice when something was wrong, to act when children were being hurt. How had she sat through yesterday's order meeting, seen Harry's thin frame and hollow eyes, and not realized what it meant? The answer was simple and damning, because no one had told her to look for it, because Dumbledore had explained about blood protection and family obligation and the greater good, and she'd accepted it without question, because she'd assumed that if there was a problem, someone more senior would have handled it. Harry stirred, mumbling something unintelligible, before settling deeper into sleep. His face was still too thin, his wrists too narrow, where they emerged from his oversized pajama sleeves. When had that become normal? When had they all started thinking it was acceptable for a 15-year-old boy to look like he'd been rationing meals for months? Tonks eased herself out of the chair as quietly as possible and slipped from the room. The hallway was empty, filled with the muffled sounds of a house waking up, voices from the kitchen below, the distant flush of a toilet, footsteps on the stairs. She checked her watch. 7:30. Her official guard duty had ended at 6, but leaving Harry alone after what he'd shared felt like abandonment. She needed answers. More than that, she needed to understand how a house full of adults who claimed to care about Harry Potter had let him arrive looking like a neglected ghost. The kitchen was warm and bright when she reached it, filled with the smell of bacon and Mrs. Weasley's anxious energy. Molly stood at the stove, her wand directing multiple pans, while she fussed over what looked like enough breakfast to feed half the order. Ron and Hermione sat at the scrubbed wooden table, speaking in low voices over cups of tea, while the twins huddled in the corner with what were definitely not ministry-approved experiments. "Morning, Tonks," Mrs. Weasley called without turning around. "How was your night? I hope Harry didn't give you any trouble." "No trouble," Tonks said carefully, settling into an empty chair. "Quiet night, really. Though I did notice. Well, he seems pretty thin, doesn't he?" Mrs. Weasley's stirring faltered for just a moment before resuming with renewed vigor. "Oh, you know teenagers. Growth spurts and such. Always shooting up faster than they can fill out." It was deflection, and they both knew it. Tonks tried a different approach. Must have been a shock when he first arrived. I mean, after a whole summer away. "He was fine," Mrs. Weasley said quickly. Too quickly. A bit tired from the journey, perhaps, but nothing a few good meals couldn't fix. Hermione looked up sharply from her teacup, and Tonks caught something that might have been disagreement in her expression before the girl carefully looked away. Ron, meanwhile, was frowning into his breakfast like it had personally offended him. "Ron," Tonks said, keeping her voice casual, "you saw Harry when he arrived, didn't you? How did he seem to you?" Ron's frown deepened. He glanced toward his mother, then back at his plate. He seemed tired, really tired, and he didn't eat much at dinner, even though Mum made all his favourites. "Ronald," Mrs. Weasley's voice carried a warning. "What? It's true, isn't it? He barely touched his food, and when I asked if he was feeling all right, he just said he wasn't used to big meals anymore." Ron looked up at Tonks with troubled eyes. What did he mean by that? Not used to big meals? The Dursleys don't exactly seem like they'd starve him. The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken knowledge. Hermione's face had gone carefully blank in the way that meant she was thinking furiously. Mrs. Weasley had stopped stirring altogether, her shoulders tense with something that might have been defensiveness or guilt. "Molly," Tonks said gently, "what condition was Harry in when he arrived? Really?" For a long moment, she thought Mrs. Weasley wouldn't answer. Then the older woman's shoulders sagged slightly, and she turned from the stove, with tears threatening in her eyes. "He was too thin," she admitted quietly. "Much too thin. And pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. His clothes were hanging off him, and when I went to take his measurements for new robes..." She stopped, pressing her lips together as if she could hold back the words. "When you went to take his measurements," Tonks prompted, "his wrists were bruised, old bruises, mostly faded. But I know what I saw. And there were marks on his arms like—" She swallowed hard, like he'd been grabbing the bars of a cage. Hermione made a small, distressed sound. Ron's fork clattered against his plate. Even the twins had stopped their whispering to stare at their mother. "Did you tell anyone?" Tonks asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Mrs. Weasley nodded reluctantly. "I spoke to Dumbledore. He said Harry's treatment at the Dursleys was regrettable but necessary, that the blood protection required him to call that place home, and that some sacrifice was inevitable for the greater good. Sacrifice. The word tasted bitter in Tonks's mouth. He called it sacrifice. He said Harry needed to understand what it meant to be without comfort, without privilege, that it would make him stronger, more determined to fight when the time came." Mrs. Weasley's voice was barely above a whisper. "He said that a pampered boy would never be able to make the choices that would be required of him." The kitchen fell silent, except for the pop and sizzle of bacon in the pan. Tonks felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest, like a shard of ice lodged near her heart. "Required of him," she repeated slowly. "What choices exactly?" But Mrs. Weasley had turned back to the stove, her shoulders rigid with the effort of holding back tears. "I can't," she said. "I can't talk about this anymore. It's not my place to question, to doubt." She trailed off, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air like smoke. Not her place to question Dumbledore, not her place to doubt the man who led their fight against the darkness, not her place to ask whether protecting Harry Potter required allowing him to be abused. Tonks pushed back from the table, her appetite gone, despite not having eaten since yesterday afternoon. "I think I'll have a look around," she said. "Get familiar with the house's defenses, since I'm supposed to be protecting Harry." No one tried to stop her as she left the kitchen. The house's magical signature was complex, layered with decades of protective spells, defensive wards, and concealment charms. Tonks let her aura training guide her as she walked the corridors, sensing the flow of magic through the walls like water through pipes. Most of it was old black family magic, dark and powerful, but contained. Over that, newer spells had been woven. Order protections, Fidelius charm work, anti-apparition jinxes. But as she studied the ward structure, a troubling realization began to form. These weren't just protective spells thrown up in haste. This was careful, deliberate work, the kind that required extensive planning and considerable skill, the kind that could easily have been adapted to include another location. She found Creature in what had once been the formal dining room, muttering to himself as he polished silver that was already spotless. The ancient house elf looked up when she entered, his bulbous eyes narrowing with suspicion. "The Aura girl," he croaked. "Come to spy on poor Creature, has she? Come to steal more of the noble house's secrets?" "Just looking around," Tonks said mildly. "Impressive ward work on this place. Must have taken a powerful wizard to set it all up." Creature's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile or a sneer. "Oh yes, very powerful. Very clever. The old fool knows his magic. Creature gives him that. Could protect anywhere he wanted, anyone he wanted. But some protections matter more than others, don't they? Some people matter more than others." "What do you mean?" "Master Regulus, he knew," Creature said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He knew the truth about the old fool, about his greater good. Used to say, 'Creature, mark my words. That man would sacrifice anyone if it served his purpose. Anyone at all.'" A chill ran down Tonks's spine. Regulus Black said that? Master Regulus was wise, too wise for his own good, perhaps. But he saw what others wouldn't see, understood what others wouldn't understand. Creature's eyes glittered with malice and old pain. The old fool could have made protections for the Potter boy anywhere. Could have warded any house, any family, any place at all. But he chose the house with the cage, chose the family with the locks and the bars and the empty plates. That's not... Tonks started to protest, then stopped. Because it was true, wasn't it? If Dumbledore could ward Grimmauld Place this thoroughly, if he could hide an entire building in the middle of London, why couldn't he have extended the blood protection to include a family that wouldn't have abused Harry? Why couldn't he have found guardians who would have loved the boy instead of hating him? Master Regulus had papers, Creature continued, watching her face with obvious satisfaction. Papers and plans and proof of what the old fool really thinks about sacrifices. Hidden them away where the Order filth can't find them, but they're still there. Still waiting for someone with eyes to see and ears to hear. Before Tonks could ask what he meant, footsteps in the hallway announced someone else's approach. Creature immediately turned back to his silver, muttering under his breath about blood traitors and unworthy visitors. Moments later, Remus Lupin appeared in the doorway, looking tired and careworn. "Tonks," he said with a slight smile. "I heard you pulled guard duty last night. How's our young charge this morning?" "Still sleeping," she said, then decided to take a chance. "Remus, can I ask you something? About Harry's placement with the Dursleys?" The smile faded from his face. "What about it?" "Were there ever any alternatives considered? Other family members? Other guardians?" Remus was quiet for a long moment, his scarred hands clasping and unclasping behind his back. "There were discussions," he said finally. "Several families offered to take him in after his parents died. The Longbottoms before what happened to them. The Bones family. Even some Muggle families who had been friends with Lily. But Dumbledore chose the Dursleys. He felt the blood protection was paramount, that Harry needed to be with Lily's blood family for the magic to work properly." Tonks thought about the ward work she'd just examined, about magic powerful enough to hide entire buildings and protect dozens of people. But surely there were ways to extend that protection, to make it work with a different family? Perhaps. Remus's voice was carefully neutral. But Albus felt that Harry needed grounding, that growing up in the Muggle world without the influence of magic or fame would keep him humble, keep him focused on what truly mattered. And what was that? His destiny, his role in the fight against Voldemort. Remus met her eyes, and she saw doubt there, quickly suppressed. Albus believed that comfort and ease would make Harry weak, that he needed to understand suffering, to know what he was fighting for. The same justification Mrs. Weasley had given, the same reasoning that prioritized Harry's usefulness as a weapon over his well-being as a child. Tonks felt sick. "Remus," she said carefully, "do you ever wonder if there might have been another way? A way that didn't require a child to suffer?" For a moment she thought he might be honest with her. She saw the struggle in his face, the weight of years of doubt and carefully suppressed questions. Then his expression closed off, and he shook his head. "It's not our place to question Albus," he said quietly. "He sees the bigger picture, understands things we can't. Harry is safe now, and that's what matters." Safe? Harry Potter, with his nightmares and his visions and his careful way of talking about being locked in rooms, was safe. The word felt like a mockery. As Remus left, probably sensing her growing distress and wanting to avoid further uncomfortable questions, Tonks found herself alone with Creature again. The house elf had stopped pretending to polish silver and was watching her with ancient, knowing eyes. "Now she begins to see," he whispered. "Now she begins to understand what Master Regulus understood. The old fool's protection comes with chains, his safety comes with cages, and when the time comes for the final sacrifice..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Tonks left the dining room with her mind spinning and her heart heavy with a terrible new understanding. Somewhere upstairs, Harry Potter was sleeping off the effects of nightmares that were more than nightmares, trusting that the adults around him knew what they were doing, trusting that his suffering served some greater purpose. But as she climbed the stairs back to her post, outside his door, one question echoed in her mind with growing urgency. What if it didn't? What if the greater good was just an excuse for doing the easier thing? What if protecting Harry Potter required sacrificing Harry Potter himself? And what, exactly, was she supposed to do about it? Chapter 4. The Secret Room. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness, each hour adding weight to the questions churning in Tonks's mind. She'd spent the morning trying to process what she'd learned. Mrs. Weasley's reluctant admissions, Remus's careful justifications, Kreacher's cryptic warnings. But the more she thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to form a picture she didn't want to see. By 4 o'clock, she couldn't stand it anymore. Harry was still sleeping, exhausted by nightmares and the emotional toll of finally sharing his burden with another person. The house had settled into its usual afternoon quiet, with most of the Order members either at their day jobs or attending to business elsewhere. It seemed like the perfect time to follow up on Kreacher's hints about Master Regulus and his hidden papers. She found the house elf in the second-floor drawing room, dusting portrait frames with obsessive attention to detail. He looked up when she entered, his bulbous eyes gleaming with something that might have been anticipation. "The Aura girl returns," he croaked. "Come to hear more truths she doesn't want to believe?" "I want to understand," Tonks said simply. "You mentioned that Regulus had papers. Proof. I need to see them." Kreacher studied her for a long moment, his ancient face unreadable. "Does she now? And what will she do with Master Regulus's truth when she finds it? Run crying to the old fool? Beg him to explain?" "I don't know," Tonks admitted. "But I can't unknow what I've already learned. And I can't protect Harry properly without understanding what I'm protecting him from." Something in her answer seemed to satisfy the house elf. He set down his dusting cloth and beckoned her to follow him toward the far wall, where a portrait of a stern-faced black ancestor glowered down at them. "Master Regulus was clever," Kreacher whispered, running his gnarled fingers along the portrait's ornate frame. "Too clever for the old fool, too clever for his own family. He saw what others couldn't see, understood what others wouldn't understand. And when he learned the truth about what the Dark Lord really wanted, what the old fool really planned, his fingers found something hidden in the scrollwork, and with a soft click, the portrait swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind it lay a narrow doorway leading into darkness. He made preparations," Kreacher finished. "Kreacher has been guarding Master Regulus's secrets for 16 years, waiting for someone with eyes to see." The hidden room was small and cramped, barely large enough for a desk, chair, and several packed bookshelves. But what struck Tonks immediately was how different it felt from the rest of Grimmauld Place. Where the house was dark and oppressive, heavy with centuries of pure-blood tradition and dark magic, this space felt almost scholarly, clean, organized, purposeful. Kreacher lit several candles with a snap of his fingers, and the room came into clearer view. The desk was covered with neat stacks of parchment, all weighted down with small stones to keep them in order. The bookshelves held not just books, but files, folders, and what looked like correspondence dating back years. "Master Regulus spent his last months here," Kreacher said quietly. "Reading, writing, planning, trying to find a way to stop what was coming. When he realized he couldn't..." The house elf's voice trailed off, thick with old grief. Tonks approached the desk carefully, as if she were entering a crime scene, which, she supposed, she might be. The top sheet of parchment was covered in Regulus's neat handwriting, notes about Horcruxes, about Voldemort's quest for immortality, about the terrible prices of dark magic. But underneath, she could see other documents, other subjects of research. "He was investigating Dumbledore," she said. Not quite a question. Master Regulus said the old fool was playing a game with people's lives, Creature confirmed. Said he talked about sacrifice and the greater good, but never seemed to sacrifice anything of his own. Always other people's children, other people's families. Tonks carefully moved the Horcrux research aside. That was important, but not what she needed right now. Beneath it, she found what she was looking for. A thick folder labeled a PWBD, the Potter Boy Project, in Regulus's careful script. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it. The first document was dated November 1981, just weeks after Harry's parents had died. It was a copy of a letter. Somehow Regulus had obtained correspondence between Dumbledore and the Ministry's Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, discussing the legal guardianship of Harry Potter. While I appreciate the Minister's concerns about placing the child with Muggles, Dumbledore had written, I must stress that the conventional options, magical families, ministry care facilities, even well-meaning relatives like Mrs. Longbottom, would not serve our purposes. The boy must be shaped by necessity, not comfort. He must learn early that the world is not kind, that power comes with sacrifice, and that sometimes one must choose between personal happiness and duty to others. The Dursley family, regrettable though their attitude toward magic may be, will provide exactly the environment needed to cultivate these essential qualities. Tonks felt sick. She forced herself to keep reading. The next document was a monitoring report dated July 1985, when Harry would have been 5 years old. Someone had been watching the Dursley household, documenting Harry's treatment with clinical detachment. Subject confined to small bedroom for 3 days following accidental magic incident. Meals reduced to twice daily. Shows appropriate signs of distress and behavioral modification. Appropriate signs of distress. Harry Potter at age 5, and someone had been watching him suffer and calling it appropriate. She flipped through more reports, each one worse than the last. Detailed accounts of Harry's punishment, his isolation, his gradual acceptance of his treatment as normal. And through it all, Dumbledore's notes in the margins, sometimes approving, sometimes suggesting modifications, always focused on the character development that such treatment would provide. But it was the letter near the bottom of the folder that made her blood run cold. My dear Minerva, it read in Dumbledore's familiar handwriting, I understand your concerns about young Harry's welfare, but you must trust that every aspect of his upbringing serves a vital purpose. The boy is not merely Harry Potter. He is our weapon against Voldemort, our final gambit in a war that may last decades. Like any weapon, he must be forged under harsh conditions to achieve the necessary strength and flexibility. The sacrifices he makes now, in comfort, in security, in the love he might have known, are investments in the sacrifices he will need to make later. When the time comes for him to walk willingly to his death, his childhood of deprivation will make that final sacrifice feel like a natural conclusion rather than a devastating loss. I know this is difficult to accept, but the boy was never meant to survive this war, Minerva. Our role is to ensure that when he dies, his death serves the cause he was born to champion. Tonks stared at the letter until the words blurred together. When he dies. Not if he dies, not if the worst happens, but when. Dumbledore wasn't preparing Harry to fight Voldemort. He was preparing him to die fighting Voldemort. And everything else, all the abuse and neglect and careful cultivation of low self-worth, was designed to make that death easier to accept. Now she sees, Creature whispered from behind her. Now she understands what Master Regulus understood. The old fool doesn't want to win the war. He wants to win it at the right price, and Harry Potter is the price he's willing to pay. With numb fingers, Tonks continued searching through the folder. She found letters from other pure-blood families, the Bones, the Abbotts, the Longbottoms, all offering to take Harry in after his parents' death. All refused by Dumbledore, with polite but firm explanations about blood protection and magical necessity. She found ward schematics showing how easily the blood protection could have been extended to any loving household. She found monitoring reports that continued right up to the present, documenting every aspect of Harry's suffering with bureaucratic precision. And finally, at the very bottom of the folder, she found the most damning document of all, a detailed timeline labeled The Potter Sacrifice, Optimal Preparation Schedule. It laid out Harry's entire life from birth to death like a military campaign, with each phase designed to build specific psychological traits that would make him more effective as a willing martyr. Phase 1. Birth to age 11. Establish baseline of deprivation and abandonment. Subject must learn to expect minimal care and to view abuse as normal. Muggle guardians ideal for this purpose. Phase 2. Ages 11 to 15. Introduce magical world gradually while maintaining emotional isolation. Subject must see himself as responsible for others' safety, but never feel truly belonged to or protected by any group. Calculated losses of parental figures, Quirrell incident, black family complications, will reinforce abandonment trauma. Phase 3. Ages 15 to 17. Escalate responsibility while increasing social isolation. Subject must accept role as primary weapon against Dark Lord, while understanding that survival is not expected. Final phase should conclude with willing self-sacrifice, motivated by desire to protect others rather than preserve self. Each phase included detailed notes about which adults should be placed in Harry's life, which information should be withheld, and how to respond to various potential complications. It was meticulous, comprehensive, and absolutely monstrous. Tonks carefully extracted several of the most damning documents, folding them small enough to fit in her robes. Her hands were steady now, her aura training taking over as shock gave way to cold fury. This wasn't just child abuse. This was a conspiracy spanning 15 years, involving multiple adults who had chosen to sacrifice a child's well-being for abstract strategic advantages. "Creature," she said quietly, "how much of this did the Order know? How many people were aware of Dumbledore's real plans for Harry?" The house elf's expression was bitter. Some knew pieces. Others suspected, but didn't want to see. Most believed what they wanted to believe, that the old fool was wise and good, and that his plans would save them all. He gestured toward the documents in her hands. Master Regulus left instructions. If anyone ever came asking the right questions, Creature was to show them the truth. 16 years Creature has waited. Why didn't you show Sirius, or anyone else? Master Sirius believes what he wants to believe, Creature said sadly. Like his friend Professor Lupin, like the Weasley woman, like all the rest. They see the Potter boys suffering, and they tell themselves it serves a purpose, that it's necessary, that the old fool knows best. Master Regulus said they would need someone from outside, someone not already invested in the lies, to see clearly. Tonks tucked the documents deeper into her robes, feeling their weight like stones against her ribs. What happened to Regulus? Really? Master Regulus found one of the Dark Lord's secret horrors, Creature whispered. Tried to destroy it. The Dark Lord killed him for it, but not before Master Regulus learned the truth, that both sides of this war see people as pieces on a board, not as human beings with lives worth preserving. The house elf's eyes glittered with tears. Master Regulus died, trying to protect the Potter boy from both masters who would use him. Creature has been trying to finish what Master Regulus started. As they prepared to leave the hidden room, Tonks took one last look around at 16 years of careful documentation, of evidence gathered by a young man who had died trying to save a child he'd never met. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a cloak. She had the proof now. She knew exactly what Dumbledore had planned for Harry, exactly how long he'd been orchestrating the boy's suffering, exactly how many people had been complicit in treating a child as an expendable weapon. The question now was what to do about it. As Creature sealed the room behind them and the portrait swung back into place, Tonks made a decision that would have terrified her just days ago. She was going to have to choose between loyalty to the Order and protection of Harry Potter. And really, it wasn't a choice at all. "Creature," she said quietly, "if I asked you to help me protect Harry from Dumbledore, really protect him, not just watch him suffer, would you do it?" The house elf straightened, and for a moment his ancient face looked almost noble. "Master Regulus would want Creature to help. Master Regulus died for the Potter boy. Creature will not let that sacrifice be wasted on the old fool's games." Walking back through the darkened corridors of Grimmauld Place, Tonks felt the documents burning against her ribs like coals. Somewhere above them, Harry was sleeping peacefully for perhaps the first time in years, trusting that the adults around him had his best interests at heart. She was going to make sure that trust was finally justified, even if it meant tearing the Order of the Phoenix apart to do it. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. Tonks found Dumbledore in what had once been Walburga Black's private sitting room, transformed now into a temporary office for Order business. He sat behind an ornate mahogany desk, silver hair gleaming in the lamplight as he worked through a stack of correspondence. The sight of him, serene, grandfatherly, radiating the calm authority that had made her trust him so completely, made her stomach clench with something between fury and grief. She knocked softly on the doorframe, the documents from Regulus's room hidden beneath her robes like secret weapons. "Nymphadora," Dumbledore said without looking up, his voice carrying its usual warm familiarity. "How is our young charge this evening? I trust your guard duties have been enlightening." The casual way he said it, enlightening, made her wonder if he somehow already knew what she'd discovered. But when he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, she saw only mild curiosity behind his half-moon spectacles. "Actually, Professor, that's what I wanted to discuss with you, if you have a few minutes." She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. "Of course, my dear. Please, sit." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, setting aside his quill with unhurried precision. "I assume this is about Harry's adjustment difficulties. Mrs. Weasley mentioned he's been having trouble sleeping." "You could say that." Tonks settled into the offered chair, her hand instinctively moving to the documents hidden in her robes. "Professor, I need to ask you some questions about Harry's placement with the Dursleys, about the decisions that were made after his parents died." Something flickered across Dumbledore's face, too quick to interpret, but definitely a reaction. "I see. And what has prompted this curiosity about ancient history?" "Harry told me some things, about his summer, about how he was treated." She kept her voice level, professional. "And I've been wondering whether all of that was really necessary for his protection." Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him, in a gesture she'd once found reassuring, but now struck her as calculating. "Nymphadora, I understand that learning about Harry's difficult childhood may be disturbing. But you must understand that every decision regarding his welfare was made with careful consideration of the larger picture. The blood protection could have been extended to any household," Tonks interrupted. "I've examined the ward structures here, Professor. I know what's magically possible. You could have placed Harry with any family that would have loved him, and the protection would have held." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dumbledore's expression remained gentle, but his eyes had gone very cold behind his spectacles. "I see you've been doing some research," he said quietly. "How thorough of you." Tonks pulled out the first document, one of the monitoring reports from Harry's childhood, and placed it carefully on the desk between them. "This is a report from July 1985. Someone was watching Harry be punished for accidental magic, documenting his appropriate signs of distress. Did you order this surveillance? Dumbledore glanced at the document without touching it. Where did you obtain this? Does it matter? What matters is whether it's accurate. Were you having Harry monitored throughout his childhood? Were you aware of how the Dursleys treated him? I was aware, yes. His voice remained calm, almost conversational. And before you ask, yes, I could have intervened at any time. The question is whether such intervention would have served Harry's ultimate best interests. The casual admission hit her like a physical blow. His best interests? Professor, this report describes a 5-year-old child being locked in his room for 3 days with minimal food. How could that possibly serve his best interests? Because, my dear Nymphadora, Harry Potter is not an ordinary child, and ordinary measures of welfare do not apply to him. Dumbledore rose from his chair, moving to the window with measured steps. He is the weapon with which we will defeat the darkest wizard of our age. Like any weapon, he must be forged under the harshest possible conditions to achieve the necessary strength. Tonks felt the world tilt around her. Even after reading Regulus's documents, hearing Dumbledore say it so matter-of-factly was still shocking. A weapon? You think of him as a weapon. I think of him as our salvation. Dumbledore turned back to face her, his expression serene. Do you know what the alternative was, Nymphadora? If Harry had been raised in comfort, surrounded by love and admiration, told from infancy how special and important he was, he would have become arrogant, entitled, unwilling to make the necessary sacrifices when the time came. He would have valued his own life too highly to give it up for the greater good. Give it up? The words came out as a whisper. You're planning for him to die. I am planning for him to choose death when the moment comes. There is a significant difference. Dumbledore moved back to his desk, his movements unhurried and precise. Harry carries a piece of Voldemort's soul within him, a consequence of that failed killing curse 15 years ago. As long as that connection exists, Voldemort cannot truly die. Therefore, Harry cannot truly live. Tonks pulled out another document, the letter to McGonagall about Harry walking willingly to his death. You've been planning this since he was a baby. Shaping him, moulding him, preparing him for sacrifice. Preparing him to make the choice willingly, yes. A reluctant martyr serves no one, Nymphadora. But a boy who has learned that life is suffering, who has never known true happiness or security, who believes his only value lies in protecting others. Such a boy will walk into death with gratitude, seeing it as a release rather than a loss. The clinical way he described it made her feel physically sick. He's 15 years old. He is the most important 15-year-old in the wizarding world. His comfort, his happiness, his individual desires, all of these are secondary to his ultimate purpose. Tonks stared at him. This man she had respected and trusted, and felt something fundamental break inside her chest. You're talking about a child, a boy who just told me he was locked in a room for weeks, who has nightmares every night, who thinks he's turning into a monster because he can feel Voldemort's emotions through their connection. And your response is that this is all going according to plan? My response is that every aspect of Harry's experience has been carefully calibrated to produce the psychological state necessary for him to fulfill his destiny. Dumbledore sat back down, his voice taking on the patient tone he might use with a particularly slow student. The abuse taught him humility and endurance. The isolation taught him that his life has meaning only in service to others. The nightmares and visions will ultimately drive him to see death as preferable to the torture of remaining connected to Voldemort. It is not pleasant, but it is necessary. Necessary. Tonks felt tears burning in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. You keep using that word. But the only thing this was necessary for was making your plan easier. You could have found another way to defeat Voldemort. You could have researched the Horcrux connection, found a way to sever it without killing Harry. Instead, you chose the path that required a child to suffer for 15 years before dying to solve your problem. For the first time, Dumbledore's composure cracked slightly. You think this has been easy for me? You think I have not agonized over every decision, every sacrifice required? But I have seen the alternative futures, Nymphadora. I have observed the paths where Harry lives and Voldemort endures. They all end in darkness, consuming everything we hold dear. One boy's life, measured against the survival of our entire world. The mathematics are quite clear. Tonks laughed, a bitter sound that echoed strangely in the formal room. Mathematics? You've reduced a human being to mathematics. She pulled out the final document, the detailed timeline of Harry's optimal preparation schedule. Is this what you call agonizing? Because it looks remarkably like strategic planning. Dumbledore's eyes went very cold as he recognized the document. Where did you get that? From someone who cared more about Harry Potter as a person than as a chess piece in your war. She stood up, the papers clutched in her hands. Someone who died trying to protect him from people like you. People like me. Dumbledore's voice had lost all warmth now, becoming sharp and dangerous. And what kind of person am I, Nymphadora? The kind who looks at a baby who survived an impossible curse and sees an opportunity. The kind who places that baby with people who will hurt him because it serves your purposes. The kind who monitors his suffering for 15 years and calls it character building. The kind who plans a child's death and calls it salvation. Dumbledore stood slowly, his considerable height suddenly seeming menacing rather than grandfatherly. I am the kind of person who makes the difficult decisions that others cannot. The kind of person who sacrifices his own soul, if necessary, to preserve the light in this world. You, on the other hand, appear to be the kind of person who would doom thousands to preserve the comfort of one. I'm the kind of person who thinks children deserve better than being treated as expendable weapons. Tonks backed toward the door, suddenly very aware of how alone she was in this room with a man who had just admitted to 15 years of calculated child abuse. I'm the kind of person who thinks there has to be another way. There is no other way. Dumbledore's voice followed her, implacable and final. And if you cannot accept that, then perhaps you are not suited for membership in this order. Perhaps your position as an Auror requires someone with a clearer understanding of necessary sacrifice. The threat was unmistakable. Step in line or lose everything, her job, her purpose, her place in the fight against Voldemort. For a moment, she wavered, thinking of what her life would look like if she opposed Albus Dumbledore. Then she thought of Harry sleeping upstairs, finally peaceful because someone had listened to him without judgment. She thought of a 15-year-old boy, apologizing for having nightmares, convinced he was turning into a monster because he occasionally felt echoes of Voldemort's emotions. She thought of a child who had been locked in a room for weeks and still worried more about other people's safety than his own. She reached into her robes and pulled out her Order of the Phoenix pendant, the symbol she had worn with such pride just days ago. The phoenix gleamed gold in the lamplight as she held it up, then let it fall to the carpet at Dumbledore's feet. "If this is what your order stands for," she said quietly, "then I want no part of it." Dumbledore looked down at the discarded pendant, then back at her with something that might have been disappointment or might have been threat. "You are making a grave mistake, Nymphadora, one that will put you on the wrong side of a war that is larger than your personal feelings about one boy's welfare." "No," Tonks said, her hand on the door handle. "I'm finally choosing the right side, and it's not yours. If you walk out that door, you become an enemy of everything I have worked to build, an enemy of the light itself." Tonks paused, looking back at this man who had shaped so much of the wizarding world's resistance to darkness who had commanded such loyalty and respect from so many good people, who had just revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person who created the darkness he claimed to fight. "If the light requires sacrificing children," she said, "then maybe it's not worth preserving." She walked out, closing the door quietly behind her, and left Albus Dumbledore alone with his grand plans and his terrible certainties. In the hallway, she paused to collect herself, leaning against the wall as the full weight of what had just happened settled on her shoulders. She had just declared war on the most powerful wizard alive, the leader of everything she had believed in, the man who held her career and her future in his hands. But upstairs, Harry Potter was sleeping safely, and for the first time in days, that felt like enough. She had work to do, allies to find, plans to make. Because if Dumbledore thought she would simply accept his vision of Harry's future, he had seriously underestimated just how far Nymphadora Tonks was willing to go to protect someone she cared about. The war between Dumbledore and Voldemort could continue without her. She had a different war to fight now, one that mattered more than the fate of the wizarding world, because it was about the fate of one boy who deserved better than being anyone's sacrifice, even if she had to fight it alone. Chapter 6. Choosing Sides. The next morning brought consequences with ruthless efficiency. Tonks arrived at the ministry to find Kingsley waiting at her desk, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant trouble. Other auras glanced their way with barely concealed curiosity before quickly looking away, the kind of studied disinterest that meant word had already spread through the department. "Watcher Kingsley," she said, settling into her chair with forced casualness. "Bit early for a social visit, isn't it? We need to talk." His voice was quiet, but carried an undertone she'd never heard before. Not the warmth of a colleague or the authority of a superior, but something colder, more formal. "Conference room 3. Now." The walk down the corridor felt like a march to execution. Tonks kept her head high and her pace steady, but she could feel eyes following her from every doorway they passed. By now, everyone would know she'd had some kind of falling out with Dumbledore. In the current climate, with the Ministry and the Order existing in uneasy tension, that made her a liability at best. Kingsley closed the conference room door behind them and activated privacy wards with sharp, efficient movements. When he turned to face her, his expression was unreadable. "Want to tell me what happened last night?" he asked. "Dumbledore didn't brief you?" The question came out more bitter than she'd intended. "He said you'd had a disagreement about Harry Potter's welfare, that you'd expressed concerns about certain operational decisions." Kingsley sat down across from her, his dark eyes studying her face. "He also said you might not be suitable for continued involvement in Order activities." Tonks felt a flicker of cold anger. Operational decisions. Trust Dumbledore to make 15 years of child abuse sound like a strategic choice. "And what did you tell him?" "That I've known you for 3 years, and you're one of the most dedicated auras I've ever worked with. That if you have concerns about a 15-year-old boy's safety, I want to hear them." He leaned forward slightly. "So I'm asking you again, what happened?" For a moment, she was tempted to tell him everything. Kingsley was a good man, a fair leader, someone she'd trusted with her life on multiple occasions, but she could also see the Order pendant gleaming at his throat, the symbol of his loyalty to Dumbledore's cause. How far would that loyalty extend? How much truth could he accept before it became too much? "Harry told me about his summer," she said carefully, "about being locked in his room for weeks, about being barely fed, about the bars on his windows." She watched Kingsley's face, looking for any sign of surprise or horror. What she saw instead was the careful blankness of someone who already knew, but hadn't wanted to think about it. "The blood protection," he started, "could have been maintained anywhere," Tonks finished. "I've examined the ward structures, Kingsley. There was no magical reason Harry had to suffer like that. The only reason was that someone decided his suffering was useful. Kingsley was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped on the table between them. "And you confronted Dumbledore about this?" "I did. And he told you it was necessary. He told me Harry was a weapon that needed to be forged under harsh conditions, that comfort would have made him weak." She met Kingsley's eyes directly. "He told me Harry was meant to die, and the abuse was designed to make him willing to do it." Something flickered across Kingsley's face. Pain, maybe, or recognition. But when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Tonks, I need you to understand something. Whatever you think about Dumbledore's methods, he's the only one standing between us and Voldemort. Without him, maybe we'd find a way to fight this war that doesn't require sacrificing children." She stood up abruptly, too agitated to sit still. "Kingsley, you know me. You know I'm not impulsive or emotional about these things. But what I learned yesterday—" She shook her head. "I can't be part of an organization that treats a 15-year-old boy as expendable. So what are you going to do? Walk away from the fight entirely?" "I'm going to fight for Harry Potter against anyone who tries to hurt him, including Dumbledore if necessary." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Kingsley's expression grew shuttered, and Tonks realized she'd pushed too far, revealed too much. Whatever sympathy he might have felt was being overwhelmed by his loyalty to the Order and its leader. "I see," he said quietly. "In that case, I need to inform you that your security clearance is under review. Pending the outcome of that review, you'll be restricted to routine domestic cases. No international work, no dark wizard apprehensions, no access to classified intelligence. And no more guard duty for Harry Potter, I suppose. That decision hasn't been made yet." Kingsley stood, deactivating the privacy wards. "But Tonks, be careful. You're walking a dangerous path, and you're walking it alone." The rest of the day passed in a haze of mundane casework and pointed isolation. Colleagues who had been friendly just yesterday now avoided her eyes. Projects she'd been working on were quietly reassigned. By 5 o'clock, the message was clear. She was being frozen out, professionally and socially. But it wasn't until she returned to Grimmauld Place that evening that she realized how deep Dumbledore's influence actually ran. Mrs. Weasley, who had always greeted her with warm smiles and offers of food, barely looked up when Tonks entered the kitchen. Remus, sitting at the table with a cup of tea, gave her a nod that was polite but distant. "How's Harry?" she asked, settling into an empty chair. "Resting," Mrs. Weasley said curtly. "He won't be needing a guard tonight." "Says who?" "Says Professor Dumbledore." Remus's voice was carefully neutral. "He feels the immediate danger has passed, and Harry needs to focus on preparing for his hearing without distractions." Distractions, like someone who might actually listen to his concerns or validate his experiences. Tonks felt anger rising in her chest, hot and sharp. "And what does Harry say about that?" "Harry is 15 years old," Mrs. Weasley said, finally turning to face her. "He's not qualified to make decisions about his own security. But he's qualified to suffer for the greater good." The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the old clock on the mantel. Mrs. Weasley's face had gone very pale, while Remus looked like he'd been struck. Even the twins, usually oblivious to adult tensions, had stopped their whispered plotting to stare. "Tonks," Remus said quietly, "I think you should leave." She looked around the kitchen, at these people she'd considered friends, allies, family, and saw the same expression on all their faces, the careful blankness of people who had chosen not to see, not to question, not to acknowledge truths that might require them to act. "Right," she said, standing slowly. "I can see when I'm not wanted." But as she reached the kitchen door, Mrs. Weasley's voice stopped her. "We want to help him," Molly said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "We all want to help him. But fighting Dumbledore won't save Harry. It'll just destroy everything we've built." Tonks turned back, seeing the pain in the older woman's face. "What if everything you've built is wrong? What if the price you're paying is too high?" "Then we pay it anyway," Remus said softly, "because the alternative is worse." "Is it?" Tonks asked. "Or is that just what you tell yourselves to make the guilt bearable?" She left before anyone could answer, walking out into the London evening with nowhere to go and no one to trust. For the first time since her confrontation with Dumbledore, the full weight of her isolation hit her. She was alone, cut off from her job, her friends, her purpose. Everything she'd built her adult life around was crumbling, and she had no idea how to put it back together. Her feet carried her automatically through the familiar streets to her mother's house in Kent. Andromeda Tonks lived quietly in a cottage that managed to be both thoroughly magical and completely inconspicuous, the kind of place where healing herbs grew wild in the garden, and the teapot always seemed to know when visitors were coming. "Dora," her mother said, opening the door before Tonks could knock. "I was wondering when you'd turn up. You look terrible." "Thanks, Mum. Really what I needed to hear right now." Andromeda stepped aside to let her in, already moving toward the kitchen with the purposeful stride of a mother preparing to fix whatever was wrong with tea and sympathy. "Sit down. Tell me what's happened." The whole story came pouring out. Harry's nightmares and revelations, the evidence in Regulus's room, the confrontation with Dumbledore, the isolation at work and among the Order. Her mother listened without interruption, occasionally refilling Tonks's teacup, but otherwise sitting in attentive silence. When Tonks finally finished, Andromeda was quiet for a long moment, staring into her own cup as if it held answers. "I'm not surprised," she said finally. "What?" "About Dumbledore. About his willingness to sacrifice children for the greater good." Andromeda's mouth twisted bitterly. "Do you think you're the first person to discover his methods? The first to object?" "What do you mean?" Andromeda rose from the table, moving to an old secretary in the corner of the kitchen. From one of its drawers, she pulled out a worn photograph and placed it in front of Tonks. It showed a group of young people in Hogwarts robes, laughing and posing for the camera with the easy confidence of youth. "That was taken during my 7th year," Andromeda said, pointing to her own younger face. "Those are some of my classmates, children from families that opposed the rising Dark Lord. Good children. Brave children." Tonks studied the photograph, noting how young they all looked, how alive with possibility. "What happened to them?" "Most of them died in the war. Not in battle, mind you, in operations that Dumbledore deemed necessary for the cause." Andromeda's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "They were sent on missions they weren't qualified for, given responsibilities beyond their abilities, placed in situations where failure meant death. And when they died, Dumbledore called them heroes and used their sacrifice to inspire others." "But surely that was different. They were adults. They chose to fight." "They were 17 and 18 years old, Dora. Barely older than Harry is now. And they trusted Dumbledore to value their lives as much as his cause." Andromeda touched the photograph gently. "I survived because I married your father and removed myself from Dumbledore's reach. But I've never forgotten what I learned about his methods. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because you needed to learn it for yourself. Because until you saw it with your own eyes, you would never have believed me." Andromeda met her daughter's eyes. "The question now is what you're going to do about it." "I don't know," Tonks admitted. "I can't fight Dumbledore alone. He has too much power, too many allies, and everyone who might help me is too invested in believing he's right. Not everyone." "What do you mean?" "You said yourself that Mrs. Weasley looked guilty when she talked about Harry's treatment, that Remus seemed conflicted, that Sirius appeared troubled." Andromeda leaned forward. People who are truly committed to a cause don't look guilty about serving it, Dora. They look satisfied. The fact that these people look troubled means part of them knows what they're doing is wrong. But knowing it's wrong and acting on that knowledge are different things. Yes, they are, which is why you need to give them a choice, not between Dumbledore and rebellion, but between their guilt and their conscience. Andromeda smiled, the expression both proud and sad. You've never been good at accepting injustice, my dear. It's one of your finest qualities and your greatest weakness. So what do? You find the others who can't sleep at night because of what they've accepted. You give them permission to feel what they're already feeling, and you show them that there's another way forward. Andromeda reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. You won't have to fight alone, Dora. You just have to be brave enough to ask for help. Walking back through the London streets as the sun set, Tonks felt something she hadn't experienced since her confrontation with Dumbledore. Hope. Not the naive hope that everything would work out easily, but the harder, more valuable hope that came from knowing she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Tomorrow, she would start building her alliance. She would find the people whose consciences were already troubling them and give them a chance to act on those doubts. She would use her position as Harry's guard, if Dumbledore was foolish enough to let her keep it, to limit his access to the boy. And if that wasn't enough, if her allies proved too few or too frightened, then she would find another way. Because walking away was not an option, and accepting the status quo was not an option. Harry Potter deserved better than being anyone's sacrifice, and Nymphadora Tonks was going to make sure he got it, even if she had to tear apart everything she'd once believed in to do it. The war for Harry Potter's soul was just beginning, and this time she wouldn't be fighting it alone. Chapter 7. Gathering Allies. Tonks returned to Grimmauld Place the next evening, prepared for another confrontation, another dismissal, another reminder that she was no longer welcome among people she'd considered family. What she found instead was Kingsley waiting in the entrance hall, his expression carefully neutral. "You're back on guard duty," he said without preamble. 10 to 6, Harry's door. Says who? Dumbledore. Apparently he's reconsidered your unique qualifications for the position. Kingsley's tone suggested he didn't entirely understand the reasoning either. Just remember what we discussed yesterday, about walking dangerous paths. Tonks studied his face, looking for clues about what had changed Dumbledore's mind, but Kingsley's expression gave nothing away, and after a moment he simply nodded and left, disapparating with the soft pop that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, settling into her familiar position against the hallway wall. Through Harry's door, she could hear the soft rustle of pages turning. He was awake, reading something, probably materials related to his hearing, which was now only 2 days away. After an hour of listening to occasional page turns and restless movements, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days ago. She knocked softly on his door. "Harry? It's Tonks. Mind if I come in?" The page turning stopped him. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine. I just thought you might want some company." There was a pause, then the soft sound of bare feet on floorboards. The door opened to reveal Harry in pajamas that still hung too loosely on his thin frame, his hair more disheveled than usual and dark circles under his eyes. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Not really." He stepped aside to let her in, closing the door behind her. "I keep thinking about the hearing, about what happens if they decide to expel me." Tonks settled into the rickety chair that had become her unofficial post during their previous conversation. "Want to talk about it?" "There's not much to say. Either they believe I had to use magic to protect myself and my cousin, or they don't. Either they accept that Dementors shouldn't have been in Little Whinging, or they don't." Harry slumped onto his bed, the legal documents he'd been reading scattered across the covers. "Dumbledore says he has everything under control, but..." Harry was quiet for a moment, picking at the edge of his blanket. Do you ever feel like the adults in your life are keeping things from you? Important things that affect your future? The question hit closer to home than Harry could possibly know. All the time, Tonks said honestly. Sometimes adults think they're protecting you by keeping secrets. Sometimes they think you can't handle the truth. And sometimes they just think you don't matter enough to deserve it. The bitter edge in his voice made her chest tighten. Harry, you matter. You matter a great deal to a lot of people. Do I? Or do I just matter because of what I represent? The boy who lived, the symbol, the weapon against Voldemort? He looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. Sometimes I feel like nobody sees Harry Potter the person. They just see Harry Potter the thing that's supposed to save everyone. Tonks felt something crack inside her chest. Here was her opening, the chance to share at least part of what she'd learned without overwhelming him. What if I told you that some people do see you as a person? That there are adults who care more about your well-being than your usefulness? I'd probably ask who, because I haven't met many of them. Well, she said carefully, you're meeting one now. Something in her tone must have conveyed more than her words, because Harry's expression sharpened. Tonks, is there something you're not telling me? She chose her words carefully, remembering her mother's advice about giving people permission to feel what they were already feeling. I think there are people in this house who care about you more than they're allowed to show. People who have doubts about some of the decisions that have been made regarding your life. Decisions like what? Like leaving you with the Dursleys every summer. Like not telling you things that affect you directly. Like expecting you to carry burdens that adults should be sharing. She met his eyes directly. I've been asking questions, Harry, about your childhood, about the choices that were made for you, and I don't like all the answers I've found. Harry was very still, studying her face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust too easily. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest some people have been more concerned with shaping you into what they think you need to become than with making sure you're healthy and happy. She leaned forward slightly. Harry, would you want to know if there were adults in your life who were willing to put your well-being first, even if it meant questioning authority figures you're supposed to trust? Yes, he said immediately, then caught himself. I mean, are there? I'm working on it. For the first time since she'd known him, Harry Potter smiled at her with something that looked like genuine hope. Working on it how? By having some very careful conversations with people who I think might be ready to hear them. The first conversation happened the next morning, when Tonks found Sirius alone in the drawing room, staring morosely at a cup of cold tea. He looked up when she entered, his expression wary but not openly hostile. "Come to tell me I'm a terrible godfather," he asked, attempting lightness but not quite achieving it. "Come to ask if you think you are." The question seemed to catch him off guard. He set down his teacup and really looked at her for the first time since her confrontation with Dumbledore. What's that supposed to mean? It means I think you care about Harry more than you care about following orders. And I think that's been causing you some sleepless nights. Sirius was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face. Dumbledore told me you'd had some kind of breakdown, started making wild accusations about Harry's treatment. Did he also tell you what those accusations were? He said you were overwrought about the boy's difficult summer, that you didn't understand the necessity of the blood protection. Tonks pulled out one of the monitoring reports she'd taken from Regulus's room. Not one of the most damning ones, but damning enough. This is a surveillance report from when Harry was 8 years old. Someone was watching the Dursleys, documenting how they treated him, and reporting back to Dumbledore. Sirius took the document with hands that weren't quite steady. As he read, his face grew progressively paler. This says they locked him in his room for a week for accidental magic. That's just one report, Sirius. There are years' worth of them. And Dumbledore knew. Dumbledore ordered the surveillance. He knew exactly what Harry's childhood was like, and he let it continue because he thought it was useful. Tonks watched Sirius's face carefully, seeing the moment when doubt hardened into something darker. When you were exonerated, did you ask to take custody of Harry? Sirius's laugh was bitter. Of course I did. The day after I was cleared, I went to Dumbledore and asked when I could bring my godson home. And he explained very patiently why that wouldn't be possible. The blood protection, the need for stability, the importance of Harry not becoming too attached to the wizarding world before he was ready. Sirius crumpled the surveillance report in his fist. He made it sound so reasonable, so necessary. But you doubted. I doubted every day. Every time I saw Harry at King's Cross, looking like he'd spent the summer in a prison. Every time he flinched when adults raised their voices. Every time he apologized for taking up space, or eating too much, or asking questions. Sirius looked up at her with eyes full of pain. But I told myself Dumbledore knew best, that I was too damaged, too unstable, too selfish to see the bigger picture. And now? Now I'm wondering if the bigger picture was just an excuse for doing the easier thing. He smoothed out the crumpled report, reading it again with fresh eyes. What do you need from me? The second conversation was harder. Tonks found Remus in the library that afternoon, surrounded by books about legal precedent and ministry procedure. Research for Harry's upcoming hearing, she realized. He looked up when she entered, his expression guarded, but not unfriendly. Tonks, how are you holding up? Better than expected. You? Concerned. He closed the book he'd been reading, giving her his full attention. Sirius told me you've been asking questions about Harry's childhood. And I'm wondering what you hope to accomplish. Even if everything you've discovered is true, even if Dumbledore's methods have been harsh, what's the alternative? Harry is 15 years old, Voldemort is back, and we're at war. This isn't the time for second-guessing our leadership. Tonks sat down across from him, recognizing the tone of someone trying to convince himself as much as her. Remus, do you remember what it was like when you were 15? When adults made decisions about your life without consulting you? Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or old anger. That's different. Is it? You were told your condition made you too dangerous for normal life, that you needed to be isolated, controlled, monitored for the safety of others, that your own desires mattered less than the greater good. She leaned forward. Does that sound familiar? Tonks. Harry is being told the same things, Remus, that his happiness doesn't matter as much as his usefulness, that he needs to accept suffering because it serves a larger purpose, that adults know better than he does what's best for his life. She watched his face carefully. You, of all people, should understand what that does to someone. Remus was quiet for a long time, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What you're suggesting, questioning Dumbledore's authority, it could destroy everything we've built. And what you're accepting could destroy Harry. The question is which matters more to you. The third conversation surprised her. She encountered Snape leaving Dumbledore's makeshift office late that evening, his face set in its usual expression of controlled displeasure. He paused when he saw her, black eyes studying her with sharp intelligence. Miss Tonks, I hear you've been making yourself unpopular with certain authority figures. Professor Snape. She kept her voice carefully neutral. I didn't realize you were staying at Grimmauld Place. Order business. His tone suggested that was all the explanation she would get. Tell me, What exactly do you hope to accomplish with your crusade on behalf of Potter's tender feelings?" The question was clearly meant to provoke, but something in his tone made her look more closely at his face. Behind the sneer, she caught a glimpse of something that might have been genuine curiosity. "I hope to make sure he lives long enough to have feelings," she said carefully. Snape's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "An admirable goal, though I wonder if you've considered that some of us have been working toward that same end for considerably longer than you have. Have you?" "Potter's nightmares," he said abruptly. "You mentioned them to someone. Recurring dreams about the Dark Lord." "Yes, and the connection between them, the way Potter experiences echoes of the Dark Lord's emotions. You know about that?" "I know many things, Miss Tonks, including the fact that such a connection poses certain risks that have not been adequately addressed by our leadership." He studied her face intently. "If you're truly concerned with Potter's well-being, you might want to consider the implications of leaving such a connection unmanaged." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, sweeping down the corridor with his usual dramatic flair. But his words stayed with her, adding another layer of complexity to her growing understanding of Harry's situation. That night, she made a proposal to the 3 allies she'd tentatively gathered. Meeting in Regulus's hidden room seemed like both necessity and symbolism, using the space of someone who had died, trying to protect Harry to plan his continued protection. "This is it?" Sirius asked, looking around the small space with a mixture of awe and pain. "This is where my brother spent his last months? Planning to protect Harry Potter from both sides of a war that wanted to use him," Tonks confirmed. "It seems fitting that we're doing the same thing." Remus had entered last, clearly uncomfortable with the secrecy, but unable to stay away. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we stop waiting for permission to care about Harry's well-being. That we start making decisions based on what's best for him as a person, not what's most convenient for the war effort." Tonks looked around at the 3 faces illuminated by candlelight. "I'm proposing that we become his advocates, his protectors, his family, whether Dumbledore approves or not." "And if Dumbledore opposes us?" Remus asked. "Then we oppose him back," Sirius said, his voice hard with resolve. "I've already failed Harry once by trusting Dumbledore's judgment over my own instincts. I won't do it again." "The risks," Remus started. "The risks of acting are nothing compared to the risks of continuing to do nothing," Tonks interrupted. "Harry's hearing is tomorrow. After that, he goes back to Hogwarts, where he'll be under Dumbledore's direct control again. If we're going to make a difference in his life, we need to start now." They talked until nearly dawn, planning and strategizing and arguing about details. But by the time they separated to catch a few hours of sleep before Harry's hearing, they had the foundation of something that hadn't existed before. A group of adults whose primary loyalty was to Harry Potter, the person, not Harry Potter, the symbol. It wasn't much against the power and influence of Albus Dumbledore, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, Tonks reflected, as she finally settled into her chair outside Harry's door, a beginning was all you needed to change everything. Chapter 8. The Plan. The morning of August 11th brought attention to Grimmauld Place that had nothing to do with Harry's upcoming hearing. Tonks could feel it in the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, in the careful way Order members avoided her eyes, in the subtle shift of alliances that had occurred over the past few days. She found her newly formed alliance already gathered in Regulus's hidden room when she arrived at the agreed-upon time. Sirius sat behind his brother's desk, looking more serious than she'd ever seen him. Remus occupied the single chair, his scarred hands clasped tightly in his lap, but it was the presence of Severus Snape, standing in the shadows near the bookshelves, that surprised her. "Professor," she said carefully, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Miss Tonks." His voice was its usual silky drawl, but his black eyes were alert and calculating. I find myself in the unusual position of sharing your concerns about Potter's welfare. Temporarily, you understand." Sirius looked up from the documents spread across the desk, copies of the most damning evidence from Regulus's collection. Snape brought some interesting information about Dumbledore's plans for after the hearing. "What kind of plans?" Snape moved out of the shadows, his expression unreadable. "The kind that suggest your concerns about Potter's long-term survival are well-founded. Dumbledore has been consulting with me about certain aspects of the connection between Potter and the Dark Lord." "The visions," Tonks said. "Among other things, he believes the connection can be exploited, that Potter can be trained to use it as a weapon against the Dark Lord." Snape's mouth twisted in what might have been distaste. He is, however, remarkably uninterested in the risks such training might pose to Potter's sanity or survival. Remus leaned forward. "What kind of risks?" "The kind that end with Potter either dead or irreparably damaged. The connection works both ways. If Potter learns to push into the Dark Lord's mind, the Dark Lord can push back. A 15-year-old boy, no matter how talented, is not equipped for such psychological warfare." Tonks felt a chill run down her spine. "And Dumbledore knows this?" "Dumbledore considers it an acceptable risk. After all, if Potter dies in the attempt, he will have served his ultimate purpose." Snape's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. I believe his exact words were, "Sometimes the sword must be sacrificed to win the battle." The room fell silent, except for the soft hiss of the candles. Tonks looked around at her allies' faces and saw her own horror reflected back at her. Even Sirius, who had lived through the First War and seen its casualties, looked shaken. "We need to move faster than we planned," she said quietly. "Harry's hearing is tomorrow. After that, he goes back to Hogwarts and directly under Dumbledore's control." "What are you proposing?" Remus asked. "I'm proposing we intercept Harry before the hearing. Make sure he has legal representation that isn't chosen by Dumbledore. Make sure he understands what's at stake and what his options are." Tonks pulled out a piece of parchment and began making notes. "We need safe houses, communication networks, people we can trust who aren't already compromised by loyalty to Dumbledore." Sirius straightened in his chair. "I have contacts, people who helped during the war, people who owe favors. Not all of them are Order members. And I have ministry connections who aren't entirely under Dumbledore's influence," Tonks added. "Aurors who joined the department to protect people, not to serve political agendas." "This is dangerous," Remus said quietly. "If we're wrong about Dumbledore's intentions, if we're misinterpreting his actions, then we'll have protected an innocent boy from abuse and given him a chance to make his own choices," Sirius interrupted. "If we're right, we'll have saved his life. Either way, I can live with the consequences." Snape moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the street below. "There is another complication. Mrs. Weasley has been asking questions about Potter's condition when he arrived. She's beginning to put together her own picture of what his summer was like. Is that good or bad? That depends on what you do with her suspicions." Snape turned back to face them. "She could be a valuable ally. She has significant influence within the Order, and her maternal instincts regarding Potter are genuine. But she could also be a security risk if she feels compelled to share her concerns with Dumbledore." As if summoned by their conversation, a soft knock came at the hidden entrance. They all froze, hands moving instinctively toward wands, before Creature's voice came through the portrait. "Mrs. Weasley is asking to speak with Miss Tonks. She seems distressed." Tonks looked around at her allies, seeing the same question in all their faces. This was the moment of truth: expand their circle of trust or maintain their security. "Let her in," she decided. Molly Weasley entered the hidden room with obvious reluctance, her eyes taking in the assembled group with growing alarm. "What is this? What's going on?" "Sit down, Molly," Sirius said gently, vacating his brother's chair. We have some things to discuss. I came to find Tonks because I've been thinking about what she said, about Harry's treatment, about the decisions that have been made. Mrs. Weasley's voice was shaky but determined. I spoke to Arthur last night about the surveillance reports I'd heard rumors about why Harry always looks so thin and frightened when he comes back from the Dursleys. Tonks exchanged glances with Sirius. What did Arthur tell you? He told me he'd suspected for years that something was wrong, that he'd filed reports about Harry's condition, recommendations for welfare checks, suggestions for alternative placement. All ignored. Mrs. Weasley's face was pale but resolute. He told me Dumbledore had specifically instructed the Ministry not to interfere with Harry's home situation. And how do you feel about that? Remus asked carefully. I feel like I've been complicit in harming a child I claim to love. Tears began to slip down her cheeks. I feel like I've been so focused on following orders and trusting authority that I forgot to trust my own instincts about what was right. Sirius leaned forward. Molly, what we're about to tell you doesn't leave this room. And once you know it, there's no going back to the comfortable ignorance of following Dumbledore's orders without question. I don't want comfortable ignorance anymore. I want the truth. They told her everything. The surveillance reports, the dismissed alternatives, the deliberate cultivation of Harry's suffering to make him more willing to accept sacrifice. With each revelation, Mrs. Weasley grew paler, but more determined. When they finished, she sat in silence for several long minutes. "Show me the documents," she said finally. Tonks spread the most damning evidence across the desk. Mrs. Weasley read each one carefully, her hands shaking slightly, but her expression growing harder with each page. "This is monstrous," she whispered. This is what the people we're fighting against do. This is how Death Eaters think about children, as tools to be shaped and used and discarded." "Yes," Snape said softly. "It is. What do you need from me?" "We need you to help us protect Harry tomorrow," Tonks said. "We're going to intercept him before his hearing, make sure he has independent legal representation, and give him the information he needs to make his own choices about his future. And after tomorrow, we become his advocates, his protectors, his family. The real kind, not the kind that claims to love him while allowing him to be abused." Sirius's voice was fierce with determination. "We give him what he should have had from the beginning. Adults who put his well-being above everything else." Mrs. Weasley wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "What about the other children? Ron, Hermione, Ginny? If we oppose Dumbledore openly, we protect them too," Tonks said immediately. "This isn't about choosing Harry over other children. This is about refusing to let any child be treated as expendable." They spent the next several hours planning in detail. Safe houses were identified, communication codes established, contingency plans developed. Snape would continue to monitor Dumbledore's immediate plans while maintaining his cover. Mrs. Weasley would handle logistics and provide cover for their activities within the Order. Sirius and Remus would coordinate with their outside contacts to establish secure locations and resources. And Tonks would be Harry's primary protector and advocate, using her Auror credentials to ensure he had proper legal representation and genuine choices about his future. "There's something else," Snape said as they prepared to separate. "The Dark Lord has been unusually interested in Potter's emotional state recently. The connection between them grows stronger when Potter is distressed or isolated. If we can improve his psychological well-being, we may actually weaken that connection. Another reason to prioritize his happiness over his usefulness as a weapon," Mrs. Weasley said firmly. "Indeed." As they extinguished the candles and prepared to leave the hidden room, Tonks felt a mixture of determination and fear settling in her chest. Tomorrow would bring Harry's hearing, and with it, their first real test as an alliance. They would be opposing not just Dumbledore's immediate plans, but his entire philosophy about the acceptable cost of fighting darkness. "Are we ready for this?" Remus asked quietly as they reached the portrait entrance. Tonks thought about Harry sleeping upstairs, finally peaceful because someone had listened to his fears without judgment. She thought about a 15-year-old boy who worried more about other people's safety than his own, who had been taught to see his own life as less valuable than the cause he was expected to serve. "We'd better be," she said, "because after tomorrow, there's no going back." As they slipped back into the main house, each going to their separate quarters to avoid suspicion, Tonks felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. They had a plan now. Not perfect, not guaranteed to succeed, but better than the alternative of doing nothing, while Harry walked unknowingly toward a future designed to end in his death. Tomorrow would determine whether their alliance was strong enough to protect one boy from the machinations of the most powerful wizard in their world. But tonight, for the first time since her confrontation with Dumbledore, Tonks felt something she hadn't dared to hope for, the possibility that they might actually succeed. The war for Harry Potter's future was about to begin in earnest, and this time he wouldn't be fighting it alone. Chapter 9. The Ministry Gambit. The morning of August 12th dawned grey and drizzling, as if London itself was holding its breath for what was to come. Tonks arrived at Grimmauld Place before sunrise, her nerves strung tight with anticipation and fear. Today would determine whether their hastily formed alliance could actually protect Harry from the machinations of the most powerful wizard in Britain, or whether they were all about to discover just how naive they'd been. She found Harry in the kitchen, sitting alone at the scrubbed wooden table with a barely touched breakfast in front of him. He looked younger than his 15 years, pale and hollow-eyed with anxiety about the hearing that would determine whether he could continue his magical education or be expelled and have his wand snapped. "Morning," she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. "How are you holding up?" "Been better?" Harry managed a weak smile. "Mrs. Weasley's been fussing over me since 5 o'clock, making sure I'm properly fed and dressed for court. She keeps saying everything will be fine, but..." He trailed off, stirring his porridge without eating it. "But you're not convinced. I keep thinking about what happens if they don't believe me, if they decide I was just some out-of-control teenager showing off with magic." Harry's voice was quiet, resigned. "Dumbledore says he has everything handled, but I can't shake the feeling that my entire future is hanging by a thread." Tonks felt her heart clench. Here was her opening, the moment to tell Harry the truth about what was really at stake. But looking at his pale, frightened face, she realized how devastating this revelation was going to be. "Harry," she said carefully, "what if I told you that your future doesn't have to depend on Dumbledore's plans? That there are people who want to make sure you have real choices about your life?" He looked up sharply, something flickering in his green eyes. "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of the rest of their alliance. Sirius entered first, followed by Mrs. Weasley, Remus, and, to Harry's obvious surprise, Snape. "What's going on?" Harry asked, looking around at their faces with growing alarm. "Is something wrong?" "Sit down, Harry," Sirius said gently, pulling out a chair. "We need to talk to you about some things before your hearing. Important things that Dumbledore hasn't told you." "Professor Dumbledore?" Harry's voice held a note of defensiveness. "What about him?" Tonks exchanged glances with the others, seeing her own reluctance mirrored in their faces. This was the moment of truth, the point where they either gained Harry as an ally or lost him entirely. "Harry," she began, "do you remember telling me about your nightmares? About the visions you've been having of Voldemort?" "Yes, but..." "And do you remember how worried you were that those visions meant you were turning into something dark, that you might be dangerous?" Harry nodded slowly, his expression growing more wary. "What if I told you that Dumbledore has known about those visions all along? That he's been monitoring your experiences, documenting your psychological state, and planning to use that connection as a weapon?" The colour drained from Harry's face. Use it how? Snape stepped forward, his expression uncharacteristically gentle. He intends to train you to deliberately enter the Dark Lord's mind, Potter. To use the connection between you as a tool for gathering intelligence and potentially attacking him directly. But that sounds like it could be useful. Dangerous, but useful. The danger is considerably greater than you understand, Snape continued. Such mental contact works both ways. If you learn to push into the Dark Lord's thoughts, he can push back into yours. For a trained Occlumens, this might be survivable. For a 15-year-old with no training in mental defenses, it would likely be fatal. Harry stared at him, confusion and dawning horror warring in his expression. But Professor Dumbledore wouldn't put me at risk like that. He's always protected me. Has he? Mrs. Weasley's voice was gentle but firm. Harry dear, where did you spend this summer? With the Dursleys, but you know that. The blood protection could have been maintained anywhere, Sirius interrupted. Harry, Dumbledore could have placed those same protections on any house, any family. He chose to leave you with people who hurt you because he thought that suffering would be useful. That's not true. But Harry's voice lacked conviction, and his hands were starting to shake. Tonks pulled out one of the surveillance reports, carefully chosen to be shocking but not overwhelming, and placed it on the table in front of him. This is a report from when you were 8 years old, Harry. Someone was watching you, documenting how the Dursleys treated you, and sending the information to Dumbledore. Harry read the document with growing horror, his face going from pale to ashen. This says they locked me in my room for a week, for accidental magic, and Dumbledore knew. He knew, and he let it continue, because he believed your suffering was necessary to shape you into the weapon he needed. Remus's voice was heavy with guilt and sorrow. Harry, I'm sorry. We all are. We should have questioned these decisions years ago. Harry looked up at them with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. How long has this been going on? Since you were a baby, Tonks said quietly. Since the night your parents died. Every decision about your life, where you lived, who you were allowed to know, what you were told about your past, all of it was calculated to produce a specific psychological profile. What kind of profile? The question hung in the air like a curse. Finally, Sirius answered, his voice barely above a whisper. The kind that would make you willing to die for others without hesitation. The kind that would see death as preferable to living with the connection to Voldemort. Harry went very still. He wants me to die. He expects you to die, Snape said bluntly. Your death has always been part of his strategy for defeating the Dark Lord. Everything else, your training, your experiences, your relationships, has been designed to make you accept that death as necessary, and even welcome. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the old clock and the soft sound of Harry's ragged breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. So everything I thought I knew about my life, about why things happened the way they did, it was all lies. Not lies exactly, Mrs. Weasley said, reaching across the table to take his hand, but manipulations, carefully constructed circumstances designed to achieve specific goals. And you all knew. We suspected, Remus admitted, some of us more than others. But we told ourselves that Dumbledore knew best, that he was wise and experienced, and saw the bigger picture. We made excuses for things that should never have needed excuses. Harry pulled his hand away from Mrs. Weasley's gentle grip, standing up abruptly from the table. Why are you telling me this now? Why today? Because today is your hearing, Tonks said, standing as well. And after today, you go back to Hogwarts, where you'll be directly under Dumbledore's control. This might be our last chance to give you a choice. What kind of choice? The choice to have independent legal representation at your hearing. The choice to know what's really at stake in your life. The choice to decide for yourself what risks you're willing to take and what sacrifices you're willing to make. Sirius moved to stand beside his godson. Harry, you don't have to be anyone's weapon. You don't have to accept that your life is expendable. Harry looked around at all of them, his expression cycling through shock, hurt, anger, and finally a kind of desperate hope. And if I choose to not go along with Dumbledore's plans? What then? Then we protect you, Tonks said simply. All of us. We become your advocates, your guardians, your family. The real kind that puts your well-being first. Even if it means opposing Dumbledore? Especially if it means opposing Dumbledore. Harry was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the surveillance report that had shattered his understanding of his own life. What do you need me to do? The ministry hearing chamber was cold and intimidating, filled with purple-robed Wizengamot members whose faces ranged from hostile to merely indifferent. Harry sat in the defendant's chair, looking very young and very alone, but Tonks noted with satisfaction that he no longer looked hopeless. Beside him sat Madam Bones's recommended barrister, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Clearwater, who specialized in defending underage wizards and had no love for ministry overreach. Dumbledore entered the chamber just as proceedings were beginning, his usual serene confidence flickering when he saw the legal representation he hadn't arranged seated beside Harry. His blue eyes found Tonks in the observer's gallery, and for a moment she saw something cold and dangerous flash across his face. "Professor Dumbledore," Minister Fudge said with obvious relief. "I wasn't expecting you to attend, but I'm glad you're here. Perhaps you can help us understand how young Potter came to be in such a situation." "Of course, Minister," Dumbledore said smoothly, moving toward the witness area. "I believe I can provide some useful context." "Actually," Barrister Clearwater interrupted, standing with crisp authority, "my client has declined Professor Dumbledore's assistance in this matter. We'll be presenting our defense independently." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Fudge looked confused. Several Wizengamot members exchanged glances, and Dumbledore's expression went very still. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying its usual gentle authority. "Harry, my boy, surely you don't want to face this hearing without proper guidance." Harry looked up at him, this man who had shaped his entire life, who had been the closest thing to a grandfather he'd ever known, and Tonks saw the moment when 15 years of trust finally cracked. "I think I've had enough guidance, Professor," Harry said quietly. "I'd like to handle this myself." What followed was the most effective defense Tonks had ever witnessed. Without Dumbledore's coaching to make him seem humble and repentant, Harry spoke clearly and confidently about the Dementor attack. He described his terror not just for himself, but for his cousin, his split-second decision to use the only magic he knew that could save them both, and his complete bewilderment at being charged for protecting innocent lives. Clearwater built on his testimony with legal precedent, expert testimony about Dementor behavior, and pointed questions about how two Dementors had come to be in Little Whinging in the first place. She painted a picture of a young man who had acted heroically in an impossible situation, rather than a dangerous child who needed to be controlled. Throughout the proceedings, Dumbledore sat in the witness area, looking increasingly frustrated, as his attempts to insert himself into the defense were politely but firmly rebuffed. Tonks could see him calculating, trying to understand how his carefully laid plans had gone so wrong so quickly. The acquittal, when it came, was unanimous. Harry Potter was cleared of all charges, his right to continue his magical education affirmed, and his actions officially recognized as justified self-defense. But as the Wizengamot members filed out, and Harry accepted congratulations from his barrister, Tonks saw Dumbledore approaching with purposeful strides. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a coldness she'd never seen before. "Harry," he said, his voice carrying its familiar warmth despite the ice in his gaze. Congratulations on your acquittal. Perhaps now we can discuss your return to Hogwarts and your continued training. Actually, Professor, Harry said, and Tonks felt proud of the steady strength in his voice. I think I need some time to consider my options. Your options? The warmth in Dumbledore's voice became strained. My dear boy, I fear you've been influenced by people who don't understand the larger picture. The dangers you face require guidance from those with experience. The danger I face, Harry interrupted, seems to come as much from people who claim to be protecting me as from those who want to hurt me. Dumbledore's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. I see. And who, precisely, has been filling your head with such ideas? People who care about me as a person, not as a weapon. The words hit Dumbledore like physical blows. For a moment, the most powerful wizard in Britain looked almost lost. Then his expression hardened, and when he spoke, his voice carried a threat that made Tonks's blood run cold. Harry, you are making a grave mistake. The forces arrayed against you are beyond your understanding, and the allies you think you've found will prove inadequate when the true tests come. I strongly advise you to reconsider this foolish rebellion. And I strongly advise you to remember that I'm 15 years old and deserve better than being anyone's sacrifice. Harry turned and walked away, leaving Dumbledore standing alone in the emptying courtroom. But as Tonks followed her young charge toward the exit, she could feel the older wizard's gaze boring into her back like a curse. They had won this battle. Harry was free, legally protected, and finally aware of the truth about his situation. But the war for his future was far from over. And now Dumbledore knew exactly who his enemies were. Chapter 2. Word of Harry's independent defense and Dumbledore's exclusion from the proceedings had clearly spread through their ranks like fiend fire. Kingsley intercepted them at the door, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes holding a warning. Dumbledore wants to see Harry immediately. Private meeting in Mrs. Black's old sitting room. No, Harry said simply, the word carrying a quiet authority that made several nearby order members turn to stare. Harry, Kingsley said, his voice taking on a paternal tone. I understand you're upset about something, but Professor Dumbledore is what? Tonks interrupted. Harry's legal guardian, his appointed representative. Because I just spent the day watching him defend himself quite capably without Dumbledore's guidance? A murmur ran through the assembled order members. Some looked confused, others concerned, and a few, notably Mad-Eye Moody and Elphias Doge, looked openly disapproving of what they clearly saw as insubordination. The boy needs guidance, Moody growled, his magical eye spinning to focus on Harry. Teenagers don't understand the bigger picture, don't understand the sacrifices required in wartime. What kind of sacrifices? Harry asked, his voice carrying a new edge that made Tonks proud and terrified in equal measure. Before Moody could answer, Dumbledore himself appeared at the top of the stairs, his usual grandfatherly demeanor intact, but something cold burning behind his blue eyes. He descended with measured steps, his presence commanding attention from every person in the hall. Harry, he said warmly, as if nothing had changed between them. I'm so pleased your hearing went well. Perhaps now we can discuss your return to Hogwarts and your continued training without the distractions of courtroom drama. Professor Dumbledore, Harry replied, his voice steady but formal. I think any discussions about my future should include the people who've been looking out for my actual well-being. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees. Dumbledore's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. Of course, my boy. Though I do think some conversations are better held in private, away from outside influences. His gaze swept over Tonks, Sirius, and the others with obvious disapproval. These aren't outside influences, Harry said firmly. These are the people I trust. Trust. Dumbledore repeated the word, as if it had a bitter taste. Harry, I fear you've been led to believe certain things about my intentions that are simply not accurate. Perhaps if we could speak alone. No. Harry's refusal was quiet, but absolute. I'm done with private conversations where I'm told just enough to make me compliant, but not enough to make my own choices. A shocked silence fell over the hall. Several Order members exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that this was far more serious than a simple teenage rebellion. Dumbledore's mask of benevolent concern began to slip, revealing something harder underneath. "Very well," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "If you prefer public discussion, then we shall have it. Kitchen, I think. Everyone." The kitchen of Grimmauld Place had never held so many people, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Order members filled every available chair and lined the walls, while Harry sat at the head of the scrubbed wooden table with his chosen allies, arranged around him like a protective guard. Dumbledore stood at the opposite end, his tall frame commanding attention even in the crowded space. But for the first time since Tonks had known him, he looked less like a wise grandfather, and more like what he truly was. The most powerful wizard in Britain, accustomed to absolute authority, and displeased with challenges to his control. "Now then," he began, his voice carrying its usual gentle authority, "I believe there have been some unfortunate misunderstandings about the decisions made regarding Harry's care and education. Perhaps if we could clear the air—" "There's no misunderstanding," Tonks interrupted, pulling out one of the surveillance reports and placing it on the table where everyone could see. "We know about the monitoring. We know about the deliberate placement with abusive relatives. We know about the psychological conditioning designed to make Harry willing to die." Gasps and exclamations erupted from around the kitchen. Arthur Weasley went pale, Emmeline Vance covered her mouth in horror, and even Mad Eye's scarred face showed shock. But it was Kingsley's expression, hurt and betrayed, that cut deepest. "That's quite an accusation," Dumbledore said calmly, though his knuckles were white where he gripped his wand. "And based on what evidence?" Sirius stood, his grey eyes blazing with 15 years of suppressed anger. "Based on this." He pulled out the folder from Regulus's room, spreading its damning contents across the table. Documents detailing every aspect of Harry's abuse, correspondence dismissing safer alternatives, monitoring reports that read like case studies in psychological torture. Order members crowded forward to read, their faces cycling through disbelief, horror, and growing anger. Arthur Weasley picked up a letter dated from Harry's second year, his hands shaking as he read Dumbledore's casual dismissal of his concerns about the boy's welfare. This says, "You considered Harry's suffering character building," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In context," Dumbledore began. "In context," Mrs. Weasley interrupted, her voice shaking with fury. "You allowed a child to be starved and locked in cages because you thought it would make him more compliant." "I made difficult decisions in service of the greater good," Dumbledore replied, his composure finally cracking. "Harry Potter is not just any child. He is the weapon with which we will defeat Voldemort. Every aspect of his upbringing was carefully calculated to produce the psychological profile necessary for that purpose." The kitchen exploded into chaos. Voices rose in anger and disbelief. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood to get a better look at the evidence, and through it all, Dumbledore stood unmoved, his expression growing colder by the moment. "You're talking about a person," Emmeline Vance shouted over the noise. "A child, not a weapon to be forged. Harry Potter ceased to be merely a child the night Voldemort tried to kill him," Dumbledore replied, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "He became something far more important. He became hope itself, and hope requires sacrifice." "Whose sacrifice?" Harry asked quietly, and somehow his soft question carried more weight than all the shouting. "Because it seems like the only person being asked to sacrifice anything is me. Because you are the only one who can." Dumbledore's composure finally shattered completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath his grandfatherly facade. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think it gives me pleasure to orchestrate a child's suffering? But there is no alternative. You carry a piece of Voldemort's soul within you, and as long as that connection exists, neither of you can truly die while the other lives. The kitchen fell silent. This was the revelation that none of them had expected, the final piece of Dumbledore's master plan laid bare. "So I have to die," Harry said, his voice steady despite the devastating implications. "You have to choose death when the moment comes. Willingly, without hesitation, without the selfish desire for survival that might compromise the magic required." Dumbledore's eyes were blazing now with the fervor of a zealot. "Everything I have done, every decision, every manipulation, every carefully orchestrated trauma has been designed to make that choice feel inevitable rather than tragic." "And if he refuses?" Sirius asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Then Voldemort wins, permanently. The wizarding world falls into darkness, and everything we have fought for is lost." Dumbledore looked around the kitchen at the horrified faces staring back at him. "I am sorry it had to be this way, but Harry Potter belongs to the cause, not to individual protectors who cannot see beyond their own emotional attachments." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the kitchen door opening. Professor McGonagall entered, her usually immaculate appearance dishevelled as if she had travelled quickly. Her sharp eyes took in the scene, the scattered documents, the confrontational positions, the mix of horror and defiance on every face. "Minerva," Dumbledore said with obvious relief, "perhaps you can help explain to our colleagues why difficult decisions must sometimes be made for the greater good." McGonagall moved to the table, picking up one of the surveillance reports with hands that trembled slightly. As she read, her face went through a transformation that Tonks would remember for the rest of her life, from confusion to disbelief to a cold fury that made her more frightening than Tonks had ever imagined possible. "Albus," she said finally, her voice carrying the chill of a Scottish winter, "please tell me this is not what it appears to be. Please tell me you haven't spent 15 years orchestrating the abuse of a child in our care." "I have spent 15 years preparing Harry Potter to fulfill his destiny," Dumbledore replied, his voice defensive but unrepentant. "Every decision was made with full consideration of the ultimate goal." "His destiny?" McGonagall's voice rose to a dangerous pitch. "His destiny was to be loved, protected, educated, and given the chance to grow into the man he was meant to be. Not to be shaped like clay into whatever weapon you deemed necessary." "You don't understand the full picture." "I understand perfectly." McGonagall's wand was in her hand now, though she seemed unaware of having drawn it. "I understand that you took a child, a baby, and decided his life was forfeit in service of your grand strategy. I understand that you allowed him to be beaten, starved, and psychologically tortured because you thought it would make him more willing to die for your cause." She turned to Harry, her expression softening with profound regret. "Mr. Potter, I owe you an apology that can never be adequate. I suspected. I questioned. But I trusted when I should have acted." "It's not your fault, Professor," Harry said quietly. "It's not any of your fault. You didn't know." "But we should have," Arthur Weasley said, his voice thick with shame. "We should have asked harder questions, demanded better answers. And now we have them," Tonks said, standing to face Dumbledore directly. "So here's our ultimatum, Professor. You will step down from any position of authority over Harry Potter. You will cease all monitoring, all manipulation, all attempts to control his choices. You will publicly acknowledge that his life belongs to him, not to your cause. And if I refuse, then we will expose everything, every document, every surveillance report, every calculation that treated a child as expendable." Sirius moved to stand beside Tonks, his wand in his hand. We will make sure the entire wizarding world knows exactly what the great Albus Dumbledore considers acceptable in pursuit of the greater good." Dumbledore looked around the kitchen, taking in the faces of people who had once followed him without question. The calculation in his eyes was visible as he weighed his options, considered his remaining allies, measured his chances of maintaining control. "You would destroy everything we have built," he said finally. "You would cripple our ability to fight Voldemort, all for the sake of one boy's feelings." "We would save one boy's life," McGonagall replied sharply. "And if that cripples your ability to fight, then perhaps your methods were wrong from the beginning." "And perhaps," Harry added quietly, "you'll find that people fight harder for a cause that doesn't require them to sacrifice children." Dumbledore stared at Harry for a long moment, and Tonks saw something that might have been genuine regret flicker across his face. But when he spoke, his voice was cold and final. "So be it. But remember this moment when Voldemort stands triumphant and the wizarding world burns. Remember that you chose sentiment over strategy, emotion over effectiveness." He straightened to his full height, once again every inch the powerful wizard who had shaped the last century of magical history. "Harry Potter, you have made your choice. I pray you can live with the consequences." "I will," Harry said simply, "because for the first time in my life, it actually is my choice." As Dumbledore swept from the kitchen in a swirl of midnight blue robes, Tonks felt a mixture of triumph and terror settle in her chest. They had won. Harry was free from Dumbledore's manipulations, protected by people who actually cared about his well-being. But they had also made an enemy of the most powerful wizard alive, and the war they had just declared would have consequences none of them could fully predict. Still, looking at Harry's face, finally free of the weight of unquestioned authority, finally able to make his own choices about his own life, she knew they had made the right decision. Whatever came next, Harry Potter would face it as a person, not a weapon, and that was worth any price they might have to pay. Chapter 11. Shattered Trust. The hours following Dumbledore's departure felt like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Debris scattered everywhere, foundations cracked, and survivors picking through the wreckage to see what could be salvaged. Tonks sat in Regulus's hidden room with the core members of what they'd already begun calling the Harry Protection Alliance, watching Harry stare at the documents that had shattered his understanding of his own life. He hadn't spoken much since Dumbledore's final ultimatum. Just sat quietly, occasionally picking up one of the surveillance reports or correspondence, reading it again as if repetition might somehow change its contents. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of processing, of a 15-year-old boy trying to reconcile everything he'd believed about his life with the cold calculations spread across the desk. "Harry," Mrs. Weasley said gently, "you need to eat something. You've had nothing since breakfast." "I'm not hungry." His voice was flat, distant. "I keep thinking. When I was 8, I broke my glasses during one of Dudley's games. Aunt Petunia made me go a week without them, said it would teach me to be more careful. I thought it was just her being cruel." He picked up one of the reports, dated from that same summer. "But someone was watching. Someone wrote down that I was showing appropriate adaptation to sensory restriction, and that it was effective conditioning for future deprivation scenarios." Tonks felt something twist in her chest. "Harry, every birthday I didn't get presents, every Christmas I spent locked in my room, every time I went to bed hungry or woke up from nightmares with no one to comfort me." Harry's voice remained eerily calm. "It was all part of a plan. My entire childhood was designed to break me down so I'd be grateful to die." "Your childhood was designed by someone who lost sight of what really matters," Sirius said fiercely. "But that's over now. You have choices now." "Do I?" Harry looked up at his godfather with eyes that seemed far too old. "Because according to Professor Dumbledore, If I choose to live, Voldemort wins. If I choose to be happy, the wizarding world burns. How is that really a choice?" Before anyone could answer, a knock came at the portrait entrance. McGonagall's voice called through, tight with controlled emotion. "May I join you? We have practical matters to discuss." They let her in, and Tonks was struck by how different the professor looked. Older, somehow, as if the revelations in the kitchen had aged her years in a single evening. She carried a thick folder of parchments and moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had made difficult decisions. "I've been consulting with Madam Bones and several colleagues in the legal department," McGonagall began without preamble. "Harry, we need to discuss your guardianship situation immediately." "My guardianship? As long as you remain a minor, someone must have legal authority over your welfare and education. Currently, that authority rests with Professor Dumbledore through his position as Chief Warlock and your magical guardian. Given recent revelations, that arrangement is no longer acceptable." McGonagall spread the parchments across the desk, pushing aside some of Dumbledore's monitoring reports to make room. "I've prepared several options. Sirius, as your godfather and now legally cleared, could petition for full guardianship. Alternatively, we could establish a guardianship council, multiple adults sharing responsibility for your welfare and decisions." "What about the Dursleys?" Harry asked quietly. "The blood protection can be maintained through ritual rather than residence," McGonagall replied crisply. "It will require monthly ceremonies, but there's no longer any need for you to return to Privet Drive." For the first time since the confrontation, something that might have been hope flickered in Harry's eyes. "I don't have to go back." "Never again, if you choose." "I choose." The certainty in his voice made Tonks smile despite everything. Here was Harry Potter, making his first real decision about his own life, and it was a simple one. He chose not to be abused. "There's more," McGonagall continued. "Your education. Hogwarts remains the best option for magical learning. But given the circumstances, we need to ensure your safety there. I propose a modified arrangement. You attend classes and live in Gryffindor Tower as normal, but with additional protections and advocates." "What kind of advocates?" "Adults whose primary loyalty is to your well-being, not to institutional authority. People who will question any decisions made about your education or training." McGonagall looked directly at Tonks. "Miss Tonks, would you be willing to serve as Harry's educational advocate? Your aura credentials would give you standing to challenge any potentially harmful assignments or expectations." "Yes," Tonks said immediately. "Absolutely." Sirius and Mrs. Weasley would serve as personal guardians, Remus as educational advisor, and myself as institutional advocate within Hogwarts itself. McGonagall's voice grew stern. "Any decisions about Harry's training, education, or welfare would require unanimous agreement from this council. No single individual would have the power to override the others." "What about Dumbledore?" Harry asked. "Professor Dumbledore would retain his position as headmaster, but would have no special authority over you beyond that held over any other student. His input would be considered but not controlling." They spent the next several hours working through the legal details, establishing communication protocols, and planning the practical aspects of Harry's new living arrangements. It was tedious work, but Tonks found it deeply satisfying. Finally, adults were making plans that prioritized Harry's well-being over abstract strategic goals. As they worked, other Order members drifted in and out of the room, some offering support, others seeking clarification about what had happened in the kitchen. The division within the Order was becoming clearer with each conversation. Arthur Weasley stopped by near midnight, his face drawn with exhaustion and guilt. "I've been going through old ministry files," he said quietly. "Reports I filed, concerns I raised, warnings I gave about Harry's condition, all of them ignored or dismissed on Dumbledore's authority. "Arthur, you tried," Mrs. Weasley said gently. "Did I? Or did I just file paperwork and tell myself that was enough?" He looked directly at Harry. "I'm sorry, Harry. I failed you. We all did." "You didn't know the full extent of it," Harry replied, but his voice was strained. "We should have known. We should have demanded to know." Similar conversations played out throughout the night as Order members grappled with their own complicity in Harry's situation. Some, like the Weasleys and McGonagall, channeled their guilt into determination to do better. Others, like Kingsley, struggled with the conflict between their horror at the revelations and their continued belief in Dumbledore's leadership. "He's still the only one with a plan to defeat Voldemort," Kingsley said during one tense exchange. "Whatever his methods, his goals remain sound." "His goals include Harry's death," Remus replied sharply. "How is that sound?" "Because sometimes individuals must be sacrificed for the greater good." "Then you sacrifice yourself," Sirius snarled. "Don't ask children to die for causes they never chose." But it was Emmeline Vance who cut to the heart of the matter. "If our cause requires us to abuse children, then maybe we're not the good guys anymore." As dawn approached, the divisions within the Order had crystallized. About half the members had aligned themselves with what they were now calling the Harry Protection Alliance, while the others remained loyal to Dumbledore's leadership, despite their discomfort with his methods. A few, like Mad-Eye Moody and Elphias Doge, had left entirely rather than choose sides. McGonagall had worked through the night on the legal documents, and by morning she had everything ready for signatures. But as they prepared for the formal ceremony that would establish Harry's new guardianship council, an unexpected visitor arrived. Dumbledore appeared in the kitchen doorway as the sun rose over London, looking older than Tonks had ever seen him. His usually immaculate robes were wrinkled, his silver hair dishevelled, and his blue eyes held a weariness that spoke of a sleepless night. "I've come to speak with Harry," he announced, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Any conversation with Harry happens in front of his guardians," McGonagall said firmly, moving to stand protectively near her student. "Of course." Dumbledore stepped fully into the kitchen, his gaze sweeping over the assembled alliance. "I wanted to apologize." The words fell into stunned silence. Albus Dumbledore, the most powerful wizard alive, apologizing to a 15-year-old boy. "I wanted you to know, Harry, that I never took pleasure in the decisions I made regarding your upbringing. Every choice was made with careful consideration of the ultimate stakes." "The ultimate stakes," Harry repeated quietly. "You mean my death?" "I mean the survival of our world, but I understand now that I lost sight of something important in my calculations." Dumbledore's voice grew softer, more genuinely regretful. "I forgot that you're not just a symbol, or a weapon, or a strategic asset. You're a person, a child who deserved better than the childhood I orchestrated for you." "Do you mean that?" Harry asked, and Tonks heard the desperate hope in his voice, the part of him that still wanted to trust this man who had been the closest thing to a grandfather he'd ever known. "I do, and I want to make amends if you'll let me. I propose a compromise." "No," Sirius interrupted. "There are no compromises when it comes to Harry's safety." "Hear me out," Dumbledore continued, his attention focused entirely on Harry. "You're right that you deserve choices about your own life. You deserve to know the truth about your situation, including the connection you share with Voldemort. But you also deserve to know all your options." He pulled out a roll of parchment, spreading it on the table. "I've been researching alternatives to the final solution I had planned, ways to sever your connection to Voldemort without requiring your death. They're dangerous, experimental, and far from guaranteed. But they exist." Hope flared in Harry's eyes, and Tonks felt her own heart leap. What kind of alternatives? Rituals that might transfer the soul fragment to another object, potions that could burn it from your system, ancient magic that might sever the connection entirely. Dumbledore's voice grew urgent. None of them are certain, and all of them carry significant risks, but they offer the possibility of survival. Why didn't you research these before? McGonagall demanded. Because the guaranteed solution seemed more reliable for the fate of our world. Because I believed that asking one person to die was preferable to risking everyone's survival on experimental magic. Dumbledore looked directly at Harry. I was wrong. Your life has value beyond its strategic utility, and you deserve the chance to fight for it. Harry stared at the research, his hands trembling as he picked up the parchments. These could actually work? They might work, that's all I can promise. But if you're willing to try them, I will commit every resource at my disposal to making them succeed. And if they don't work, then the choice of what to do next will be entirely yours to make. The kitchen fell silent as everyone processed this unexpected development. Tonks found herself torn between hope and suspicion. Was this genuine remorse and changed priorities, or simply a new strategy to regain control over Harry? There's a condition, Dumbledore continued. These alternatives will require years of preparation and research. You would need to remain under protection, continue your education, and work with researchers who understand the magic involved. You would need, in short, to trust me enough to let me help save your life. Why should he trust you? Mrs. Weasley demanded. After everything you've done. He shouldn't, Dumbledore replied simply. But perhaps his guardians might be willing to supervise that trust, to ensure that any research conducted serves Harry's interests, not mine. Harry looked around the table at the faces of his newly appointed guardians, seeing the same conflict in their expressions that he felt in his own heart. This could be manipulation, another way for Dumbledore to maintain control while appearing to offer choices. But it could also be genuine, a chance for Harry to live, to have a future beyond martyrdom. I want to try, Harry said finally, but under my terms, with my guardians overseeing everything, with the right to stop at any time if I decide the risks are too great. Agreed, Dumbledore said immediately. And I want it understood that this doesn't excuse what you did to me. The abuse, the manipulation, the 15 years of calculated trauma, none of that becomes acceptable just because you're offering an alternative now. I understand, and you're right not to excuse it. As they worked out the details of this new arrangement, Tonks felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. They had fought for Harry's right to choose, and now he was choosing to trust, cautiously, conditionally, the man who had orchestrated his suffering. It wasn't the ending she had expected, but perhaps that was the point. Real life rarely offered clear-cut victories or absolute justice. What it offered was the chance to do better, to make different choices, to prioritize what truly mattered. Harry Potter was alive, free to make his own decisions, and surrounded by adults who put his well-being first. After 15 years of manipulation and abuse, that felt like victory enough. But as she watched Dumbledore carefully sign the documents that limited his authority over Harry's life, Tonks couldn't shake the feeling that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The real test of everyone's commitment to Harry's welfare would come in the months and years ahead, as they worked to give him something he had never had before, a chance at a normal life. Chapter 12. A New Dawn. 1 week later, Tonks arrived at her new office at the Ministry to find official confirmation of what she'd been hoping for, her formal assignment as Harry Potter's primary aura protector, authorized by the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes in conjunction with the newly established Potter Guardianship Council. The parchment bore Madame Bones's seal and signature, making it as official as anything in the wizarding world could be. She smiled, tucking the document into her robes as she prepared to apparate to Grimmauld Place for her morning check-in. The past week had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, administrative changes, and careful adjustments as everyone learned to navigate Harry's new living arrangements. But for the first time since she'd discovered the truth about Dumbledore's plans, Tonks felt genuinely optimistic about Harry's future. The changes at Grimmauld Place were immediately apparent when she arrived. The oppressive atmosphere that had once permeated the old house had lifted noticeably, replaced by something that actually felt like a home rather than a headquarters. The smell of Mrs. Weasley's cooking drifted from the kitchen, where voices could be heard laughing, actually laughing, over breakfast. "Watcher, everyone," Tonks called as she entered the kitchen, and was pleased to receive a chorus of genuine greetings rather than the wary acknowledgements of a week ago. Harry sat at the head of the table, looking healthier than she'd seen him since, well, possibly ever. The hollow exhaustion that had shadowed his eyes was beginning to fade, replaced by something that might actually be hope. He was engaged in animated conversation with Hermione about some book they'd been reading, while Ron listened with the patient expression of someone who didn't understand but was happy to see his friends excited. "Morning, Tonks," Harry said, looking up with a smile that reached his eyes for the first time in her memory. "How's the new job title treating you?" "Officially, I'm your primary protective liaison," she said, settling into an empty chair. "Unofficially, I'm still just someone who thinks you deserve better than being anyone's sacrifice." "I'll take it." Harry's smile was genuine, though she could still see shadows in his expression, the kind that would take time and care to fully heal. "Mrs. Weasley's been explaining the new schedule for when I get back to Hogwarts. It's different." "Different how?" Tonks asked, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Weasley. "Well, for starters, I'll have regular check-ins with my guardianship council. Not just when there's a crisis or when someone decides I need guidance, but scheduled meetings where we actually discuss what's happening in my life and what I need." Harry's voice held a note of wonder, as if the concept of adults proactively caring about his well-being was revolutionary. "And," Hermione added with satisfaction, "any special training or additional responsibilities have to be approved by the full council. No more secret missions or dangerous assignments without proper consideration of the risks." "What about defense against the dark arts?" Ron asked. "You're still going to learn how to protect yourself, right?" "Of course, but the focus is going to be on protection and escape, rather than—" Harry hesitated, then found the words. "Rather than preparing for martyrdom." Remus looked up from his own breakfast, his scarred face thoughtful. "We've consulted with several experts about training regimens that build confidence and skill without encouraging reckless heroism. The goal is to teach you to survive, not to die gloriously." "Sounds boring," Ron said, with a grin that took any sting out of the words. "Boring sounds wonderful," Harry replied, and Tonks heard the profound truth in those simple words. After 15 years of being the boy who lived, the chosen one, the weapon against Voldemort, Harry Potter finally wanted the chance to be boring. After breakfast, Tonks found herself walking with Harry through the quieter corridors of Grimmauld Place, ostensibly so she could check the house's security arrangements, but really so they could talk privately. The change in him over just 1 week was remarkable. Not a complete transformation, but the beginning of one. He walked straighter, spoke more freely, and most importantly, seemed to actually believe that his opinions about his own life mattered. "Tonks," he said, as they paused outside the room that had once been Walburga Black's sitting room, where Dumbledore had maintained his temporary office. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For keeping your promise." Harry's voice was quiet but steady. "That morning when you were assigned to guard my door, You heard me having nightmares and came in to help. And when I told you about the visions, about feeling like I was turning into a monster, you promised me I wouldn't have to face it alone." Tonks felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You don't need to thank me for that, Harry. It was the right thing to do. Maybe. But you did it when no one else would. When everyone else was following orders and trusting authority, you decided to trust your own judgment about what was right." He looked directly at her, his green eyes serious. "You kept your promise. I'm not alone anymore, and Dumbledore, well, he can't just do whatever he wants with my life anymore." "No," Tonks agreed. "He can't." They continued their walk, checking wards and security measures that were now designed around Harry's well-being rather than his containment. The difference was subtle, but significant. These protections were meant to keep dangers out, not to keep Harry trapped within predetermined boundaries. "What's it like?" Tonks asked as they examined the strengthened entrance ward. "Knowing that you have choices now?" Harry was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Terrifying," he said finally. "And wonderful. And confusing. I keep catching myself asking what Dumbledore would want me to do, or what would be best for the war effort, instead of what I actually want. That'll take time to change. I know. But I'm starting to figure out some things I actually want. Like going back to Hogwarts, not because it's strategically important, but because I want to finish my education. Like learning magic not because I need to be a weapon, but because magic is amazing, and I want to understand it better. Those sound like excellent reasons. And I want to try the research Dumbledore mentioned, the alternatives to—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. "Not because I'm afraid to make sacrifices, but because I think I'd like to have a future. I think I'd like to see what kind of person I become when I'm allowed to grow up normally." As they completed their security check and returned to the main areas of the house, Tonks reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. When she'd first been assigned to guard Harry's door, she'd been a loyal Order member, following instructions she didn't entirely understand. Now she was part of an alliance, dedicated to protecting one boy's right to have a childhood, an education, and a future. The afternoon brought a meeting of Harry's Guardianship Council: Sirius, Mrs. Weasley, Remus, McGonagall, and Tonks herself. They gathered in what had once been the formal dining room, but which Mrs. Weasley had transformed into something more welcoming, with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle rather than the intimidating formal table. "First item," McGonagall said, consulting her notes. "Harry's return to Hogwarts. The legal arrangements are finalized. He'll attend classes normally, but with additional protections and regular check-ins with his guardians." "What about Dumbledore?" Sirius asked. "Professor Dumbledore will retain his position as headmaster, but his authority over Harry will be limited to that of any other student. Any special requests or assignments will require council approval." McGonagall's voice was crisp and professional. "I've also arranged for Harry to have access to independent counsel within the school, teachers and staff who are not bound by loyalty to Dumbledore's authority." "And the research into alternatives?" Remus inquired. "Proceeding carefully," McGonagall replied. "Professor Dumbledore has provided his preliminary findings to the council for review. Nothing will be attempted without unanimous approval from Harry's guardians, and of course, Harry's own informed consent." They spent an hour discussing practical details, educational plans, and safety protocols. But what struck Tonks most was how different this felt from Order meetings. Instead of being told what decisions had been made about Harry's life, they were actively involving him in planning his own future. "Any other concerns?" McGonagall asked, as they prepared to adjourn. "Just one," Harry said, speaking up from his position in the circle. "I know this is a lot of work for all of you, and I know it's complicated having to oversee everything. If it ever becomes too much—" "Harry," Mrs. Weasley interrupted gently, "caring about your well-being isn't work. It's what adults are supposed to do for the children in their care. Besides," Sirius added with a grin, "after 12 years in Azkaban, getting to be an overprotective godfather is pretty much the best job I can imagine." That evening, as the sun set over London, Tonks found herself back in the corridor outside Harry's room. Not as a guard assigned to watch his door, but as his protector checking in before the night shift took over. The distinction mattered more than she would have expected. Harry's door was open, and she could see him sitting at his desk, working on what looked like ordinary homework rather than world-saving preparations. The sight filled her with a satisfaction she couldn't quite name. "Everything all right?" she called softly. "Perfect," Harry replied without looking up from his essay. "Well, nearly perfect. Snape still assigns too much potions homework, and I still have nightmares sometimes. But Remus taught me some techniques for managing the visions, and when I do have bad dreams, there's always someone to talk to. That's what family's for." Harry did look up then, his face brightening with genuine happiness. "Yeah, it is." As Tonks prepared to leave for the night, her official duties ending at 6, though she knew she'd never really stop watching out for Harry, she reflected on the promise she'd made that first night. She'd told him she would never let Dumbledore near him again, and while that hadn't been literally possible, she had managed something perhaps more important. She'd helped ensure that Dumbledore could never again have unchecked authority over Harry's life. Walking through the London streets toward her own flat, Tonks felt a deep sense of completion. The scared, isolated boy who'd told her about his nightmares and visions was learning to trust that the adults in his life actually cared about him as a person. The 15-year-old who'd apologized for having feelings was beginning to understand that his feelings mattered. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still dangers ahead, still challenges to face, still healing to be done. But for the first time in Harry Potter's life, he was facing those challenges with the support of adults who put his well-being first. He had advocates, protectors, and family who would fight for his right to have choices about his own future. And somewhere in a castle in Scotland, Albus Dumbledore was learning to lead a war effort that didn't depend on sacrificing children. Tonks smiled as she unlocked her front door, already planning tomorrow's check-in with Harry. She had kept her promise. Harry Potter would never again have to face his demons alone. And watching him begin to heal, begin to hope, begin to believe in his own worth, beyond his usefulness as a weapon, was the greatest victory she could imagine. The war against Voldemort would continue, but the war for Harry Potter's soul had been won. One careful conversation, and one protected choice at a time. And that was enough to build a future on. In the end, protecting one boy's right to grow up safely had changed everything. Not just for Harry, but for everyone who had learned to value the person over the cause, the individual over the institution, the child over the weapon. It was a good lesson, Tonks thought as she settled in for the night. One worth remembering as they faced whatever came next.